Shewer Mahar Majin, good morning. This is what a conference looks like in a time of COVID. We are calling this a boutique Belfast International Homecoming. What that means is that throughout the day there'll be no more than 100 people here. We're delighted to be joined online by our Belfast ambassadors and allies from around the world. I said to our dear friend Ambassador Sean O'Dowd in New York, Sean must an early start. You're 4 hours behind this week. We're starting at 4:20 your time, and he said that's okay. He gets up at 4 o'clock. So that's the sort of nutcases there are all around the world who are ambassadors and allies and advocates for Belfast. Over the next couple of hours, we're going to look at the key issue around the green agenda for the city of Belfast, but also we're going to ask a question of how we can build a better bridge to the diaspora and make sure that we seize all the opportunities, many challenges of course from the green agenda, but how as a city and a people we can seize all the opportunities of this green transition. We're going to start this morning by welcoming up an honorary chair of the Belfast International Homecoming, Mike Nesbitt, MLA, who's going to chair the first session. Mike is also headed to the States shortly. And in that role, Mike, when you go to the States, you have to bring at least 2 ambassadors back with you. So we'll be waiting for you to come back from your trip to the States and tell us who you want to be inducted as ambassadors next year. So as we move on through the day, tonight in City Hall we'll be bringing in a new cohort of ambassadors, but let's get started today online here in Titanic Belfast. Please welcome Mike Nesbitt, MLA.
Thank you, Martin, and thank you to Conla and the Homecoming team for thinking of me. It's a pleasure to get this year's Homecoming underway. This session is about sustainable tourism. It's quite short, so I'll give you short introductions. The speakers that we have for you, Susan Pickin is Director of the Cathedral Quarter and Culture Night. Susan, if you'd like to come up and have a seat. Shona McCarthy is from these parts, but now famous as Chief Executive of the Edinburgh Fringe. Shona, you're very welcome. And another chief, we've got the Chief Executive of Tourism NI, John McCrillan, and hopefully joining us by the wonders of technology from the wonderful city of Ljubljana, we have Masa Klemenčić, who represents the Slovenian Tourist Board, and there she is. Nice to see you, Masa. Thank you for joining us. Now, we have 2 themes that I would like to explore. One is sustainable tourism, and the other is events. And as the Homecoming is an event, I think it's appropriate we start there. So, Shona, what are the actions and thoughts that you've had to take on board in terms of making the Fringe more sustainable?
I mean, for those of you who don't know the Edinburgh Fringe, it's kind of known now for being the biggest performing arts festival in the world. And I suppose that's the kind of the first shift in mindset, is to get people away from quantifying it or sort of, I suppose, expressing its value by its scale. So we now talk about the Fringe as being the biggest platform for freedom of expression. And it's really been a 5-year journey already. We haven't kind of waited till COP26 to try to make it the greenest festival on the planet. And partly that has been about a move to digital. So in the last 2 years, we've made a major investment in the digital platform, because one thing we don't want to compromise on is the international reach of the festival. In 2019, it had 63 different countries represented on the stages, and nobody wants to see that go. We want it to stay outward looking and international. So the hybrid is absolutely there to stay. It will continue to be part digital and part live. And that is about trying to reduce the need for people to travel. And it's the second kind of big thing for the Fringe was we were producing 375,000 programmes every year that were the size of a telephone book, because the Fringe has become so big. So reduction of printed material is another massive part for us. So anybody who knows the Fringe and loves to get their flyers and accumulate their flyers on the Royal Mile in Edinburgh, we're hoping that's going to be a thing of the past. So kind of the removal of printed materials, the shift to digital, and then the third thing is working in partnerships. because we can only do bits of it. And one just really simple example is we started to produce and make keep cups and reusable bottles for people who come to the city to go to the festival. But then people were coming to us and saying, well, where do we fill these bottles? So we had to then talk to the council about, look, you've got to meet us halfway here. So there are now water fountains all throughout Edinburgh that people can go and refill their bottles. And it's that kind of partnership approach that's really going to take us forward to being carbon net zero by 2030. We're founding signatories to the Climate Compact, and we're absolutely determined that as a cultural organisation, we're going to play our part in that.
Thanks, Shona. Susan, Culture Night was flying, and then you got hit by a pandemic. How did that impact on your thinking, participants' thinking, audience thinking?
Well, I mean, before the pandemic, Culture Night, the last Culture Night in 2019, we had just shy of 100,000 people on the streets over the course of 2 days. And I remember it really clearly because it was actually the day of the climate strike in 2019 when all the young people were in the city centre and there was a lot of mobilisation around it. And, you know, in terms of environmental sustainability and awareness, that's always been a key part of what we do. We've always worked really closely with TransLink to try and promote sustainable travel, to promote people walking, you know, not bringing their car into the city centre. We had really big messaging around waste. You know, bring a plastic bottle with you, bring your own bottle with you. You know, if you want to get food, why don't you bring a lunchbox with you rather than having disposable containers? But it's really difficult when you've got that amount of people. And it really, by the end of those couple of days, it was really clear that, you know, actually this is a much, much bigger challenge than we can kind of, you know, just deal with in one day. The pandemic actually allowed us to hit the reset button in some ways. The 2020 edition was entirely digital and actually was a really kind of successful experiment. But I think the whole point about Culture Night is it's live and it has people out on the streets and it brings people together. And it allows people to come into the city and sort of embrace the city and you know, reclaim the city in some ways. So for this year, we really hit the reset button and thought, right, we're going to go small. And I really agree with what Shona said. It's always measured by numbers and bigger, 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 bigger. And bigger isn't always necessarily better, especially when it comes to environmental sustainability. So we decided to go small. We decided we were going to be as environmentally sustainable as we could possibly be. And we actually also did our first commission. So we basically commissioned a creative team to build and develop a big installation in Ryder Square. It was it was inspired by nature, because I think nature is one of the things that's got us all through the pandemic. You know, if you think about how often we all went out and walked, and it really helped, I think, a lot of people. And Belfast isn't the greenest city either. So we wanted to try and bring a bit of nature back into the city centre and do something beautiful and make the city centre beautiful and make people maybe see it in a fresh way. So we had this massive installation called the Om Grove, which is inspired by the Om tree alphabet, which is an ancient Celtic alphabet. It was a huge installation, took up most of Ryder Square, sound and light, ambient light. There was a digital trail that accompanied it that led people around the cathedral quarter. So after they had been to see the installation and sort of explored that, they could then go off and go on a treasure trail and find these little wooden plaques that had codes on them. And then, you know, they sort of pulled together all the clues and then they could win a prize. So it was aimed at really getting people out and about and round, not just exploring the cathedral quarter, but also visiting the businesses and trying to kind of push some of that back towards the businesses, but in a slightly different way. And I think overall it was really successful. I mean, nowhere near the numbers that we would have had on a normal Culture Night, but then it was a lot smaller. We had about 8,000 people over the weekend, which I was really pleased with. Feedback was really positive. I think people really enjoyed a different experience. And for us, for sustainability, what was really important, the installation it took up a sizable part of Ryder Square. Everything was reused and recycled. Absolutely everything. The structure was made of pallets. It was covered with plastic sheeting that goes back to the building trade. Even the nuts and bolts that held it all together was reused. The only waste we had at the end of it was like less than a wheelie bin full of printed vinyls, and that was it. And the sound and lighting equipment and everything was hired in. And because we weren't selling food, there was no waste, there was no problems in terms of, you know, plastic bottles or that sort of thing. And we also went paperless, so we didn't have any print. So in terms of sustainability, we reckon that 95% of what we did went back into the sort of the cycle.
One wheelie bin of waste, that's something I'll take away. John, for you, I imagine the challenges are a little bit different in that hybrid presumably doesn't work if your job is to attract tourists. But how important are events in your schedule?
Well, I mean, just sort of quickly comment on the sustainability agenda. I mean, we've just come back from World Travel Market, which was on in London this week, and sustainability was right at the fore. And I think from our perspective, and for all of us in the island of Ireland, we have sustainability brings us real challenge because 80% of our industry is based on people flying here. Air travel is seen to be one of the greatest offenders in that regard. So I think as the island of Ireland and here in Northern Ireland, we almost have to beat everyone in this sustainability sort of race here, because we've got to overcome the fact that we've got this challenge in terms of how people get here. And I think COVID has really given everybody an opportunity, as Susan has said, to rethink and reset. And we're thinking and we're resetting in terms of what the strategy going forward is. And events will be a central element of all of that, because when people travel, I think there are a number of elements to sustainability. One is around, from our perspective, it's not just about the environment, it's about being economically sustainable, and it's also about being socially sustainable as well. And I think it's really important now, as we move forward, that we're not simply focused on the numbers of people who travel here and how much they spend. I mean, what we're really focused in now is the benefit that tourism brings to the host community, because if it's not bringing benefit to the host community, what is the point in having those things in the first instance? And the traveller really wants to experience those things which are authentic and of the place. And I think there's nothing better defines the place than the events that take place within it. So Edinburgh is almost defined by the festival and the Fringe Festival. And I think here in Belfast, we have become known for the International Arts Festival, for Culture Night, makes a serious contribution to all of that. So we are looking at, I suppose, 4 tiers of events. So those large events which we can bring here, which allows us to portray Northern Ireland in a very positive light globally. So I think bringing the Open here last, in 2019 and coming back in 2025 is a good example of that. R&A are really focused in on the sustainability agenda and how they make that event sustainable. We want to support those larger Indigenous events that are of the place, and I think there are some challenges around this. One of our biggest events is the Northwest 200. So how you get that to fit with the sustainability agenda is going to be a challenge for the organisers of that, but we have to help them to do it. We also want to support local events. So if we look at things like East Side Arts and what's being done on the East Side and what's happening with Fela and Fubble, those local events give visitors things to do when they come here, helps people understand the culture of the place that they're in, and allows them to engage with local communities. So that's an important element of what we do. And then the fourth element is, the conferencing business. Because the conferencing business is really critical to cities. It brings in business during the week. It brings in business out of season. But in order to win a conference now, the city has to demonstrate its sustainable credentials. The organisers are looking, sustainability will be one of the first items on the criteria in terms of selecting where people go. So the fact that Belfast in the last 2 weeks has been, I suppose, identified as being one of the top 20 sustainable cities on the planet makes us, puts us in a really good place to help bring that business in, and it allows us then to demonstrate Belfast as a centre of excellence for cybersecurity and fintech and biosciences, those things which we've got real strengths. And not only does it bring visitors into the city, but it allows us to demonstrate that Belfast is a centre of excellence and can bring with that then the foreign direct investment that we want to see in those high-tech sectors. So events have got a very significant role to play, I would say, not just in tourism, but also in how we position ourselves globally as an investment location to help grow the wider economy.
Masa, Slovenia has quite a reputation in this area. Tell us about your green scheme of Slovenian tourism, please.
First of all, thank you for having me and thank you for having thought of Slovenia. So I don't know how well you know the green scheme of Slovenian tourism, but for Slovenia, it's actually a tool to position ourselves globally. I'm going to repeat a little bit what other speakers said already, that bigger isn't always better. And Slovenia is a very small country, something of the size of Northern Ireland, I think. And our offer isn't adapted to mass tourism. Even if we wanted to have big numbers of arrivals, overnight stays, we just don't have enough accommodation facilities and so on. So over a decade ago, we decided that the way to go is sustainable tourism. Also because what is very typical of Slovenia, I think, is this greenery, nature, the offer of outdoor sports. And in order to preserve that, we wanted to really come up with a system that would support all types of stakeholders in developing sustainable behavior. By this, I mean destinations, travel agencies, accommodations, and so on. So we started in 2009 already with different documents, with different tips for hotels on how to become more green, more sustainable. But of course, this wasn't enough. So the green scheme of Slovenian tourism was developed in 2015. So this is the 6th year that we've had it, and we already have 200 members. Among them, we have 88 accommodation facilities and 59 destinations. So the scheme offers, it's not only a certification system, but it actually offers tools to these different stakeholders to improve their sustainable behavior. We don't have events in the scheme at the moment, but we are working on it, and we are working with destinations so that they would implement their own events, their own green events. It is based on international standards, on the Global Sustainable Tourism Council standards, and this is something that is of key importance for the scheme, I think, because it has to be internationally comparable. The scheme it's not only important from this developmental point of view, but also for the global promotion of Slovenia, because as I said in the beginning, we want to position ourselves as a green country with authentic offer. And I mean, of course, we can say that on a national level, because we mainly at the Slovenian Tourist Board, our main job is to communicate Slovenia internationally. And we can always say, yes, Slovenia is green because we have green forests, we have clean water, and so on and so on. But when people come to Slovenia, guests, foreigners, and so on, they are going to, we want to show them that that it really is true. We want to say, yes, we are green because we have 88 green accommodations who don't use plastics, who respect their environment, who employ mostly locals. And I think this is the main challenge at the moment. So we want to have even more businesses that are going to act in this way. And we also want to offer more green products so that these the holders of the Slovenia Green Label can continue to support this global image of Slovenia.
Thanks, Masa. Could I ask you how you measure the impact of this scheme? First of all, for the participants, also for your economy and for your reputation. Yeah,
that is a very good question. So mostly we measure the number of accommodations, of destinations who have this Slovenia Green Label. And this is also saying something, because this label, the Slovenia Green, isn't just based on the criteria that we came up with, but it's based on international certificates such as the Green Globe, Bio Hotels, Travel Life, and so on. So this is one indicator. But we are not at the moment, for example, measuring CO2 emissions or how much plastics is being used or reused. It is measured in destinations that have the Slovenia Green Label, but not in a systematic manner. So they have their data for their own destination, but we don't collect them on a national level because all destinations don't do it. We have Slovenia Green Bronze, Silver, Gold, and Platinum destinations. And bronze destinations, for example, aren't doing some of the things that they're required to do. So this will be the next challenge, to really measure in a very systematic way and on a national level the impact of the scheme and of this sustainable behavior. And I think a very big step is going to be made next year, because we are currently writing our new strategy of sustainable tourism for the whole country. That will be because the last one, the current one, it's only valid until the end of this year. So in the new strategy, 2022 to 2028, we are not only to include these classical indicators like the number of arrivals and overnight stays, because the numbers aren't everything. And for the first time, we are going to include the indicators that are in the green scheme on a national level. This means we are mostly going to focus, so we have already identified some of the key indicators, among them CO2 emissions, and also the satisfaction of local inhabitants with tourism. And I think this is going to be one major step in developing our sustainability. So there are still a lot of problems or challenges, as you can see, but I think we are addressing them. And for the second part of your question, you asked me how we are measuring the effect of the green scheme in marketing. We are not measuring it, because it is practically impossible to know how many people come to Slovenia just because they've heard of Slovenia Green or because they've heard about our sustainable endeavors. I think it's, in any case, in tourism, the point, I mean, how you get people, how to have successful marketing is to have products and interesting accommodations. It's not just sustainability, but it's the products that are based on sustainability. So for the moment, it's impossible to measure how many people come just because of that, but we are going to keep working on developing more of such products and to have more such accommodations.
Thanks, Masa. Shona and Susan, I would imagine maybe a few years ago, if you'd heard somebody was flying in from Australia or the United States for the Fringe or Culture Night, you know, there'd be a kind of wow factor about it. I presume you're a bit more conflicted these days.
It's funny, you know, people think because of the scale of the Fringe that it's a kind of huge international tourism driver, but it's only 7% of the visitors anyway were from overseas. Largely, the audience base is Edinburgh and Scotland, and then the rest of the UK. And our kind of marketing mantra over the last 5 years has been one more show, not two more feet. So we were already kind of minded of our role in sort of managing tourism. But having said that, and I think especially coming from here, we don't want to restrict the movement of artists. Definitely kind of up for restricting the movement of audiences, but I just think it's so important for storytellers and artists and performers to be able to travel. But yet there's smarter ways, and I think even the connection between Ireland and Scotland, like all these performers come to Edinburgh every year to perform on the stages of the city, and then they go back home again. You know, why are we not working more closely together with our theatres here so that when people do travel, they're making use of that opportunity and they're travelling right around the UK. So I think there's a lot of work for us to do as a sector to make when travel does happen, to make it more sensible and to use the opportunity to really kind of tour across these islands rather than just coming to do one gig and heading back again. So.
Yeah, no, I absolutely think it does need to be more strategic. I mean, we wouldn't have the sort of level of artists that you have coming in by any stretch. Most of our audiences are local. Most of the people who perform at Culture Night and work at Culture Night are local. But we do have people coming in, you know, from the rest of the UK and from ROI. And I think that, you know, for me, if we can get people to come, but then also maybe stay and do something else as well, so that their visit isn't just for one thing, but it maybe spreads out, so there's a wider economic benefit. I think you're never going to have a completely environmentally sustainable event. It's just not possible, but it's about pros and cons and weighing up the balances and trying to think, right, what are the bits that we can sort of control and look after and actually, you know, try and mitigate the impact of that. And then what are the other bits that are out with our control, really? And I think it's just a really strategic approach to that.
So there would be a sense of maybe if a member of the diaspora was coming home anyway at some point, that you'd be encouraging them, build your trip around the Fringe, build your trip around Culture Night.
Absolutely, yeah.
John, for you, I'm thinking it might be not so much about actions as influencing. Is that the sort of position you feel you're in?
It's really about both. And I think it's fair to say, I mean, Slovenia has sort of set the benchmark for the rest of us in terms of what we need to be doing. So, I mean, one of the things that we're currently, just at this point in time, we've got a Kickstart programme running. It's a £3 million support fund for the tourism sector. And a big element of that is doing a sustainability audit of whether that be destinations, whether it be businesses, whether it be events, to look to see how we can work with them to become more sustainable. Because the reality is the consumer wants to see and wants to visit sustainable destinations. So being sustainable is not just the right thing to do, it's what you must do in order to secure the visitor. So I think we need to undertake those actions. Some of the things we're doing, for example, we're working with our colleagues in Fáilte Ireland and a university in Oxford to try to identify what the carbon footprint of the tourism industry on the island of Ireland is, north and south, in order to set a benchmark to work towards how do we reduce that and how do we then make our contribution towards the sustainability targets that have been set and are being discussed at COP this week. So those are things that we need to do from an action point of view. But you're absolutely right, Mike. Influence is incredibly important as well. And whilst we sit within the Department for the Economy, if we look at the contribution that cultural venues and the arts and built heritage sector contribute to the tourism product, we have no influence over that. That sits, and the responsibility for those sit within another government department. And if I'm honest, it's really difficult. The civil service talk and the executive talk about integrated working and joined up working and outcomes-based accountability. In practice, that is much more difficult to deliver. So working across, 9 or 10 different government departments with ministers from different political parties with different political outlooks makes that quite challenging. But if we're going to be a sustainable destination, we have to sustainable transport. Our public transport needs to improve. We need to look after our environmental assets and our landscapes much better, which are part of DERB. Some of those are responsibility for the Department of Infrastructure. In many ways, we have a responsibility for policy and delivering some of those actions. But probably 80% of what we have to offer and what we need to build upon from a tourism product perspective to secure the interest of the consumer from overseas doesn't lie within our gift. So that influencing piece is incredibly important.
Well, that's a hobby horse I'll not get on today. But when I first went to Stormont 10 years ago, I couldn't believe the way each department just works in a silo, in a vertical silo, and obsessed with just doing stuff. The inputs of government without looking at the outputs and the outcomes. So, for example, we know that if children aren't performing at school, you don't just point the finger at the Minister for Education, because healthier children do better at school. So the Minister for Health's got a role to play. Children in better quality housing will do better in life, so the Minister for Communities has something to play in. And getting all that together, I'd love to go into the programme for government, John, but I'm being told that our time is up. So Masa, thank you so much for joining us from lovely Ljubljana, and Susan and Shona and John. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. That's it.
I thought I was going to have to start Mike Nesbitt when he started at Stormont, but he stopped himself. That's great self-restraint and self-control. I'm Mark Sheen, and while you're host of Homecoming, and during the day we'll have a number of moderators who will be linking our discussions. And the first today is Victoria Danoon, and Victoria is a Belfast Homecoming ambassador. She, for a long time, was our woman in Massachusetts when she worked at UMass Lowell and UMass State University System. She's now here working with the Odyssey Trust. We're looking forward to seeing W5 back going at full strength, and the Belfast Giants, of course, are back playing again. So we hope to see the entire SSE arena and the Odyssey back to full strength and back open shortly. But please welcome Victoria Danoon.
Thank you, Martin, and thank you very much to Mike and our first panel. It was a great way to get us started. So as you all know, today is about making connections, and that is something our next speakers know a thing or two about. Sustainable tourism and planning in city neighbourhoods is a collaboration connecting Belfast's east and west neighbourhoods. If you could please welcome Harry Connolly, CEO of Fáilte Fíorsa here, and Chris Armstrong, Tourism Development Manager from Eastside Partnerships, to tell you more about that.
Okay, Chris. Well, Mazin Moya, Dave. My name is Harry Connolly. Thanks for the introduction, Victoria. And this is Chris Armstrong, my friend from the East. We're going to talk about the work that we've been doing over the last number of years, connecting East and West Belfast tourism under the banner of the City Connections programme. This is Chris and I in Kilkenny, pre-lockdown, winning an award for good relations, which we're very happily and grateful to accept. But that's not what underpins this work. What underpins the work that we do with the City Connections programme is very much driven about connecting tourism assets and ensuring that local people benefit fully from the social and economic benefits of tourism at the local level, that they're maximised at the local level. Thanks to Belfast City Council also for resourcing and funding the programmes that we've brought forward from 2017. So it's going to be a bit of a double act this morning, so I'm going to jump here and back and forth and whatever else. So over to Chris for the next piece.
Yeah, so basically we got together, funded, as Harry said, through by Belfast City Council, and teamed up with Professor Terry Stevens, who we'd actually been over in Ljubljana. This is quite coincidental that we've just heard from Massa this morning, to look at how other cities and other countries deliver on sustainable tourism. And actually, just to pick up on a few things Massa said, and actually John brought up, everything is completely connected in Ljubljana. Every hotel's talking about green, every tour provider's talking about green. There's free electric buses across the city. So I think the point is well made that it's more than just the tourism leaders, it's actually the whole city and the whole country is coming together under that green agenda, and it's really impressive to see in Ljubljana. So we'd worked with Terry and we'd been over there, and we knew Terry well. Terry knew the organisations well, knew East and West Belfast well, and we asked Terry to pretty much do two things. To look at the state of neighbourhood tourism in Belfast, what's working well, what's not working so well, to critique the drive of both Eastside Tourism and Fáilte Fíorsa here to see what we could do better, but also then to identify other international best practice examples, really delving into local initiatives, sustainable tourism initiatives, find out how they're funded, who's driving them, and very importantly, which came up this morning as well, how they're impacting, or how they're measuring their impact. So yeah, really pleased also that Terry's receiving his recognition this evening from the Homecoming conference through the Ambassador Medal, and I think both Harry and I would say that there's nobody more deserving, so I think it's brilliant to see.
See how this is working there? Okay. And back to me. So the findings of that report that we commissioned Terry to do and his team of European tourism experts, we are delighted to share with you here this morning, and thankful for the Homecoming platform to do that. There's 8 key points that we can take away from that report, and we'll run through some of them with you today. The first one, and I suppose the most striking, was that your community, our community, the Belfast community, the neighbourhood tourism models are sustainable, they're resilient, and they're highly appropriate for the new post-COVID world of urban tourism. You see that Belfast City Council have just about to release, or have released, a 12-week consultation on their new tourism strategy for the next 10 years. Front and centre is neighbourhood tourism, front and centre is urban tourism, and we're delighted that in West and East Belfast that the work that we've been doing is now coming forward and recognised at a policy level, and Terry was able to pull that out. Secondly, that our work is comparable and stands the test of international best practice, but there's still much more to achieve. So what we're doing in Belfast is good. There's lots of positives, but when you compare to the likes of Ljubljana or Bilbao or other sort of European best practice models, there's much more to do.
Yeah, and sustainability has obviously been massively on the agenda this week, probably more than any other, and certainly in my lifetime. And I think Harry and we've been developing sustainable urban tourism for, 15 years probably in West Belfast, if not longer. So I think it's something that we've always seen as essential. I think now it's very much recognised that it's not just desirable but essential. And Jerry Lennon in Visit Belfast often talks about how the visitors are now demanding it. Well, I would go one step further and say I think we're all demanding it. I think residents and locals in the neighbourhood are also demanding sustainable tourism. Through Terry's report, he also unpicked sustainability a little bit more, and we've focused very much today on environmental already, but I think it's fair to say that tourism for a long time has been looking at economic sustainability, which is rightly so. We've also, over the last 5 years, certainly in East, been looking at the societal impacts of tourism and how we actually identify the social element of sustainability. Terry went another step further and talked about territorial and governance, which we hadn't really come across before. But actually in our language, in terms of regeneration, what he's referring to there is local ownership. And that is something that actually Terry is saying that we are doing very, very well here in Belfast. The concept of actually creating ownership within communities so that actually local people are ambassadors and champions of local development, of local tourism is a great thing. And actually there's a concept now of tourism being more than just the numbers, but actually the impact of tourism resonates long after visitors have gone back home. The concept that we're actually developing tourism as a tool to create better places to live and better places to visit, which anybody who knows Terry will know. I've heard that phrase a few times before. But that's something that actually Terry is saying, that actually in East and West Belfast and across other parts of the city, that actually Belfast is really strong.
And I suppose what we're talking about here is the approaches directly relevant to the emergent trends in the recovery, the regrowth and the reimagining of tourism in Belfast and beyond. That urban tourism, neighbourhood tourism, community benefit is now front and centre. The reset button has been well and truly hit, and I suppose even at that policy level that I referred to earlier on, the next 10 years is about taking tourism in a different, more comprehensive place. International best practice has also shown that small intervention can make a big difference, and that's a nice soundbite and whatever else, but what does it mean for us here? What does it mean to this gathering of civic leaders and change makers? And for me, what I take from that is, and a saying that's always stuck with me, is let the creatives collide. So John, who's the chief executive of the Tourist Board, and talked about 3 million funds, and we're all after that, and we're all torturing John for more investment and funding in Belfast City Council and so on. But the small interventions I think that can be made from the likes of the public sector could be pulling together a forum to allow the creatives to collide. So how do we get the private sector investor, the hotelier, into a room with a community artist and see what happens and see what those hotel rooms may look like? So it's those small interventions and small initiatives, I think, that can make so much of a difference as well.
And then the final points that Terry brought up through the report is that leadership, and we've talked a little bit about leadership here this morning, leadership is not something which should be monopolised by those at the top, the city leaders, but actually the ethos of leadership should be instilled and distilled through the veins of a destination, so that there's really leadership and creative ambition throughout every element of society and also everybody who's involved in tourism at a local level. Terry himself uses Fáilte Fíorsta here in Eastside Partnership, our neighbourhoods in East and West Belfast, as best practice examples when advising other cities and other destinations. And he actually said that the people who need to recognise the best practice locally is ourselves, and he's looking at me and Harry in that respect. I suppose when we think about neighbourhood tourism, we think very much about the untapped potential and the opportunities that lie within the city. I suppose it's fair to say when we read this report and it was written with fresh approach and took a new look at it, I think it's fair to say the pace has certainly picked up in terms of neighbourhood tourism development in Belfast. The pandemic has been a massive mindset shift for everyone. I think probably now our focus is also looking at, as that pace does pick up and the momentum builds, how do we actually do that in a sustainable way in terms of sustainable tourism, placemaking, but also the concept of destination stewardship to ensure that everything is done in a balanced way and appropriately for local communities and visitors. So I think we're probably not quite comfortable to recognise ourselves as best practice yet. If we deliver this successfully over the next 5-10 years, then I think probably we would. So yeah, that's probably us in terms of summing up the report, summing up a wee bit about the work of East and West Belfast. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak to the conference here for a few minutes this morning, and yeah, looking forward to the conference and chatting to folks on the sides. Thanks very much.
Thanks, folks.
Thank you very much, Harry and Chris. There's a special bond that exists between Belfast and the United States, and it's one that we get to celebrate and highlight every year at this particular conference. And it is my distinct pleasure now to welcome Chris Rendo, Deputy US Consul General, to provide the official opening of the 12th Annual Belfast International Homecoming.
Thanks. Good morning. It's a great pleasure to be here today to open the annual homecoming. For 12 years, this gathering of great minds has united people from Belfast and across the United States. Together, it has addressed shared challenges in a genuine spirit of partnership, and countless new friendships have been forged as a result. I've only been in Belfast, I don't know, the last few months. I arrived in August. But already, I've encountered a region that is open for business, eager to capitalize on its potential, and enthusiastic about building strategic relationships. Prior to taking up my assignment in Belfast, I had the opportunity to talk with some friends and colleagues who had previously been posted here. Marcin, from these conversations, your reputation precedes you, so I'd like to thank you and your team in particular for everything you've done to help forge closer relationships between the United States and Belfast. And while, as I mentioned, I am new to the city, I've only been here a few months, I actually have had the opportunity to visit a few times in the past. The last time I was here, I was working for the Secretary of State's policy planning team, where we were investigating how Brexit would impact U.S. business on the island of Ireland. Luckily, Brexit has now been completely solved, and I'm able to focus exclusively on improving my golf game. That was my attempt at a joke. I'm terrible at golf, and Brexit is still on. These visits don't afford much downtime, but like any visitor, the city's proud industrial maritime heritage became very evident to me after just a couple of days here. I learned that one of our first U.S. diplomats was ever posted here as a consul to the port of Belfast. I discovered that the export of goods helped establish Belfast as the cradle of the Industrial Revolution. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, I learned more about how mass immigration of people from the port of Belfast made an indelible footprint in the social fabric of my fledgling nation. And I can say, even from my own personal experience, that my family traces part of their own roots to this region of the country. So, it's been great to have that own personal connection. It's fitting, therefore, that we celebrate this homecoming event in a truly world-class visitor attraction, one that acknowledges the city's past, but one that also looks confidently towards a bright future. It's to your credit that the theme of this year's homecoming centers around the shared challenge of climate change. This week's COP26 conference has reminded us all that this is not a challenge for future generations, but one that we must confront today. President Biden recently arrived in Glasgow after taking action in the United States, investing in clean energy technologies and creating jobs while encouraging other countries to do more. Over the remainder of COP26, the United States will launch a range of new initiatives and partnerships with other countries. With the expertise of the private sector, we will mobilize action in key areas, including methane, clean energy, forest, and industrial decarbonization. While tackling the climate crisis is imperative, it's also the greatest economic opportunity of our time. Together, we can and will create high-value jobs, both in the United States and Northern Ireland, and new industries as we address the climate crisis. To you all, thank you for your commitment to improve the lives of the neighborhoods and communities in which you serve, as well as those beyond it. The talent in this room has every capacity to address the biggest challenges and opportunities that we all face, and I wish you well in your continued efforts. Thank you for having me here this morning.
I should have sat a little closer to the podium. Thank you very much for that, Chris. Our response from the diaspora is next. And speaking from New York, please enjoy this message from Sean Kelly, Chair of KPMG Advisory Board and Vice Chair of the Ireland Funds.
Hello everyone. I'm sorry I can't be with you there today, but I want to send the best wishes on behalf of all of the diaspora here in New York and in the United States. I'm joining you from the new Irish Arts Centre here in Hell's Kitchen on the west side of Manhattan in New York, where we're weeks away from our opening night of our new $60 million state-of-the-art facility. It's been a long journey for us, including navigating a global pandemic right at the end, but we're proud and excited that we'll be a small part of the reopening of the arts and cultural sector here in New York. We're also proud that we will be able to again welcome artists from all over the island of Ireland here to the Irish Arts Centre to give them a platform and a shop window in the United States. As part of this rebirth and thinking about it, and the reason why I brought it up is it reminds me a lot of back in 2010 when we were re-emerging from the financial crisis, a reopening, a rebirth of the economy. Many of you have attended the New York, New Belfast conferences over the years. I think back in 2010 might have been the first conference, similar context about regrowth and rebirth. And I remember at that time there was also a focus and a recognition that the green agenda at the time could provide a perfect platform and opportunity for renewed investment and growth, and created a great opportunity for the island of Ireland. In fact, I remember speaking about that at the conference, and at the time I came across a Chinese quote which said, "When the winds of change blow, some build walls, others build windmills." And I think that's equally, if not more important today. And even back in 2010, we had the green agenda, not as critical or as important as it is today, but it was there. We also had the fear that borders would go up, international trade would be curbed, and countries would become isolationist from an economic standpoint, something similar that we're facing today. So while the context of coming out of COVID is different, I think the issues are very similar. And I think the importance of the ESG agenda across all aspects of it, environmental, social, and governance, are not only important to the whole global economy, they create a tremendous opportunity for Belfast, for Northern Ireland, and for the island of Ireland, from a technology standpoint to a manufacturing standpoint, including manufacturing windmills. I think it also creates a tremendous platform to rebuild and to build further on the great relationships between the US and Belfast and the island of Ireland. So the topics that you're going to be discussing today are important, very important from a climate change and the future of our planet, but I think are also vitally important for the success, the prosperity of the island of Ireland. So no pressure in your discussions, but I wish you all the best on behalf of the diaspora for your discussions, and I look forward to seeing many of you again when I'm able to get back to Belfast. Thank you.
The next session, University of Ulster Reborn in Belfast, £250 million campus with sustainability at its core, will be presented by Professor Neil Hewitt, Director of the Centre for Sustainable Technologies and Head of the Belfast School of Architecture and the Built Environment at Ulster University. I'd like to welcome Neil up to the stage. And as Neil's coming up, please enjoy this short video provided by Ulster University.
City Deal is a very exciting part of a new journey. We're trying to think of new and innovative and clever ways to start to put an ecosystem and an infrastructure together that can really drive this city and this economy onto greater and better things. And to have this sort of collaborative approach where you're looking to bring universities back to the fore as problem solvers alongside industry and business really puts Belfast on a global map.
So the biggest barrier facing everybody who's trying to innovate at the minute is that they can't do it on their own. Community is going to be the key, and the City Deal centres that are coming will give us the scale that we've never had before, that we're going to be able to do partnerships with companies that would never have considered us before.
I mean, if you look at the Game of Thrones effect in Belfast, you know, it's transformed how people perceive a Belfast media company. To build a perception that we're a centre of excellence in this space in terms of the UK and also globally, I think is incredibly important.
A building where more people can collaborate, provided that the collaboration still occurs and provided that the resources are there, that sets Northern Ireland ahead of a bunch of individuals. If we see that collaboration as a win, then there can't be anything but good that comes out of this.
Successfully completing R&D as well would really help us with the commercialisation and usefulness of certain games development tools, and that would be a great help to not just our company but the local sector.
I can already see within the 20 projects that I'm responsible for globally within EY, I can see that a number of those would play incredibly well into some of the facilities that City Deals envisages building here in Belfast. It's not just about creating the facilities, it's about how do we get the right partnering clients to come in with the right ideas that we can show, you know, truly innovative technology being produced that has application in a global marketplace, and that would be a great success for the City Deals project.
We've seen massive changes across most industries, retail, banking, media. Construction has been slow. There's been very little disruption in construction over the last 10 years, but we're seeing that starting to come through. We've invested heavily in digital, and more recently we've invested heavily in modern methods of construction, and we see the relationship with City Deal and AMEC as the opportunity to take that even further.
The polymer processing sector in Northern Ireland is very strong. By engaging with the regional City Deal and the formation of AMEC, there will be influence in what equipment is put in there, which is relevant and lends itself to the development of that sector. But not only that sector, advanced manufacturing in Northern Ireland will be supported by AMEC and all the facilities that it provides.
It's very important that locally here we have expertise not only today but also continuing to grow and develop in the future. And if we can keep that research expertise, we can keep the talent pipeline of students coming through for the business, and we can maybe even have some of the infrastructure which will help us to develop things as fast as possible without having to travel to other parts of the world, then City Deal will really deliver for us.
The opportunities for us are continuing to build better and more efficient product. And really, to build better and more efficient product, we really need to work with technology. And something like City Deal actually allows us to actually work with people who will help us with that innovation. Look at what is the right technology to use, what is the most cost-effective technology to use.
A big issue for us is getting access to data, because we need data in order to design clinical trials appropriately, and iReach will help us get access to that data. We have built a software platform, a unique software platform, and we need to get access to projects, collaborative projects, where we can demonstrate the value of that software.
City Deals is a fantastic opportunity for ourselves at Dell Technology. It enables us to provide some of our world-class technologies and giving access to people. We're very excited to work with people with big ideas and some of the great visionaries that exist in Belfast.
We want to have an environment with infrastructure and culture and an ethos that people want to opt to live in Belfast, that the environment that surrounds us is something that's very attractive, and so the whole of the City Deal is critically important to our ability to develop that business model.
Not a lot to say after that, really. So thank you very much to Martin, etc., for his kind invitation. I'm going to start with this, but I'm going to move on, which is more in keeping to what City Deals and Innovation is going to talk about. So you all know the Belfast campus. It is. First and foremost, in relation to COP26, we're very proud of some of our colleagues, well, all of our colleagues, but some of our colleagues who've actually made it there and actually delivering on aspects of materials, nutrition, food, etc., which are all becoming big messages within COP26. And we're pleased to state that virtually all our courses and all our research covers all 17, if you like, of the Sustainable Development Goals. But moving on to the new campus. The new campus itself is, unfortunately in my mind, not Southwest College and its passive standard, but it's certainly of a high energy efficiency standard. And it has many sustainable features built into it, including a lot of natural daylighting, etc., even though it's a deep pan building, and so forth. One of the interesting sustainable features, of course, is the fact that you note at the bottom there are 2,700 steps, which, as we were around on a tour with the lifts not working just yet, you get fit very quickly. So the sustainable students will be ultimately our goal. So it is an amazing project, and it'll be an amazing site when it's fully operational. However, we're not stopping there. We're looking at net zero. How are we going to achieve that? And one of our campuses we used as a model, because it's the Coleraine campus in this case, because it's on an area of the Northern Ireland's electricity network, which is a spur. So how can the university support the electricity network in that area? So we have our wind turbines on site. We're proposing and investigating batteries and other forms of storage. We're looking at decarbonising the heating through heat pumps, etc. And can we do that without adding burden to the electricity network while decarbonising at the same time? And sort of, yes, we can. But it's not the most economic way of doing things, operating as an island. The key thing is for a site like that, and a site like the Greater Belfast Development, and a site like Belfast City Hospital, which are investigated as well, is working with the electricity market to store excess wind power when available and release from your big battery packs, etc., when the network demands it. So playing those market services is a key thing. And so integration of renewables on site or working as a big load that can control what happens is very important. That's one of the things we're exploring in a bit more depth. A lot of research projects that explore these sort of things. From very small scale, Solar Fin to Go brought regular power to schools in Botswana where PV and storage, photovoltaics and storage, meant you had a reliable power supply and kids online in primary schools for the first time. The main comment on that photograph from our institution perhaps was the health and safety aspect of one of our researchers standing on the roof without a harness on pre-COVID, but the excitement got them, so we'll not worry about that. Interreg 5A Spire 2 looks at where we place storage in the border counties in Northern Ireland and the west coast of Scotland to manage growing amounts of non-dispatchable renewable energy. We can't control when the wind blows and the sun shines, but we can manage it and manage that optimal use so we don't curtail it, we don't turn it off when the system doesn't need it. We store it and use it for, in this case, a non-windy day. Other projects that I could briefly mention is, of course, Foyle River Gardens. For you, as you may know, it is going to be the Eden project in the northwest, and that has the potential to operate again as what we call a demand-side unit. It'll store heat, in this case, provided by heat pumps, but driven during off-peak times. So when there's too much wind or cheap electricity at night or whatever, it'll do that and use that heat during the day. It then will move on to start providing system services. So the heat pumps will run when the electricity demand is low, and the buildings will be heated when the electricity demand is high and heat pumps are turned off. The decarbonisation of data centres with geothermal energy looks at a very much an untapped source in Northern Ireland. We've had some of the best geothermal resources in the UK, not Iceland geyser type stuff, but good hot temperatures. Hot spot being anyone from Ballycastle, you're sitting on the hottest spot in Northern Ireland. So we can start to think of how we extract that and deliver that with heat networks, or indeed transport that heat via modified trucks with what are called thermochemical materials, i.e. salts, and bring the heat to the end user. Then we're thinking about hydrogen, how we successfully store hydrogen for vehicular transport, heavy vehicles, and indeed, in my opinion, used for power generation when the power it can't be provided from wind or solar. They're the key priorities for that. And then a spin out of Interreg 5A Spire 2 is Roulette, where we're looking at decarbonising houses. We'll start the pathway to decarbonising houses with improved insulation, a heat pump, thermal storage, so that it can integrate into the electricity network and provide low carbon electricity and low carbon heat to, in this case, social housing users, people who actually need that. So those are just exemplar projects of where Ulster's going and how we're trying to integrate those on a larger scale back into the net zero campus. But to finish, and very quickly run through, energy efficiency is incredibly undernourished. It's something we don't consider in a huge way because it doesn't produce big photo opportunities and it doesn't produce, sexy technologies quite often. But it's very, very important. Reduce the demand, and that can be through technology, through behavioural change. As it's been mentioned a lot in COP26, we should stop eating so much meat. So I enjoyed my bacon bap earlier. So before I move to veggie bacon. And consider, please, energy efficiency first in all our thinking. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Hewitt. Our next session, Legislating for a Green Future, is very timely. The chair of this session is the fantastic Amanda Ferguson, freelance journalist with The Washington Post, BBC and RTE. Before Amanda introduces her panel, we have a short video from one of our sponsors, MRP in Philadelphia.
Create personalized buyer experiences is challenging for enterprise marketers needing to coordinate insights and actions across teams, platforms, channels, and prospects worldwide, while effectively measuring program impact. So MRP created the only ABM platform that features what B2B marketers want and the enterprise organization needs. With enterprise administration, teams operate in a single platform, sharing insights and measurement, but executing programs independently. Advanced data management recomposes account-based data from contact-based systems. Intelligent Insights identifies signals and prescribes best actions. Omnichannel orchestration coordinates content and messages across channels. And revenue-based metrics provides account-level measurement, drilling down from programs to tactics. No matter how big or complex your ABM strategy, MRP empowers you to simplify and amplify your connection landscape for faster, attributable, and higher revenue impact at global scale, in real time, all the time. Helping our clients connect to theirs. It's not just a tagline, it's our purpose. Learn more at mrpfd.com.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Legislating for a Green Future. So we're going to be looking at the proposed climate bills that are before Stormont, how change can be driven around emissions and the journey to net zero. So I'm Amanda Ferguson, and I'm joined today by Sinn Féin MLA and former Minister John O'Dowd, by Planning and Environmental Law Barrister at Francis Taylor Building Chambers in London, Conor Fagan, and PhD researcher and KRW Law Paralegal, Anurag Deb. So we're going to come to the climate bills that are before Stormont shortly, but we're going to start, John, with you, with your small-scale green energy bill. So can you explain to us a little bit about what that bill actually is? And with regard to that, I've heard you reference democratising energy production. Can you explain what you mean by that?
My piece of legislation is an enabling piece of legislation, and it calls on the Minister of the Economy to bring forward a scheme to support the introduction of small green energy production, and that could be in family homes, businesses, farms, etc. And it is about allowing small producers to feed into the network. Now, it's not a new idea, it's not an original idea, but the reality is, in this jurisdiction, we have fallen behind in small micro energy production for a variety of reasons. We're all familiar with the RHI scandal. We're familiar with the NIRO scheme, the Renewables Obligation Scheme, which wasn't in any way on the same scale as RHI. And there's lessons to be learned from both of those. So my piece of legislation is quite simple, 6 clauses, calls on the future minister to bring forward a scheme to support small green energy production of around 50 kilowatt per producer. It doesn't mention subsidies, it doesn't mention supports, because that's a matter for the scheme. And as we see developments taking place at COP26 and how investment will take place in this sector, then I think there is opportunities in the future for not only state intervention, but most likely there will be private intervention in this as well. So all producers, all major producers of over 5%, which is the majority of producers here, will be obliged to pay a minimum price to small energy producers to ensure that they're getting a regular income and they can feed into the grid. So that's basically it.
Okay, and it allows the small producers to make some money?
Yes, money makes the world go round, and those who are whether in business or in small farms or even family homes, that extra income I'm sure will be very welcome.
And where else is it done?
It's done, this is routine across Europe, particularly in Denmark and Holland. There's significant support and investment in this. But this is routine across Europe and many other states. So it's doable, it's achievable. It just needs the legislative support and also the political will to make it happen.
And what about the regulation side of it? How does that work?
Well, I would like to see it fall under the utility regulator, and indeed only yesterday the Economy Committee, of which I'm a member, had a presentation from the utility regulator with more bad news about energy rises. But the utility regulator, in terms of home heating, for instance, only regulates the gas sector and the electricity sector. 60% of family homes here are still heated through oil. They're not regulated. The oil, home heating oil is not regulated. So I would like to see this scheme fall under the regulator, utility regulator, for regulation to ensure there's quality and fairness for all involved.
We know that one of the criticisms of Stormont was there wasn't enough legislation coming through the chamber, and obviously people may be aware that the Speaker Alex Maskey had written out to MLAs last week indicating that I think something like 30 different pieces of legislation that are competing to get through Stormont, in this mandate, and there isn't very much time left, so there's going to be victims to that. Where are you in that process? Like, are you confident that your bill's going to make it through, or?
I'm reasonably optimistic that it's in the right stage of the process now. Whether it goes through or not is at the end of the day whether Assembly members vote for it or not. It's at committee stage. It's currently out of consultation. So if people have views, and obviously people in this room do have views in these matters, it's available through the Economy Committee website for submissions of evidence and views on the bill at this stage. That's there until January 2022. Then I'll move forward to consideration stage and further consideration stage. So I'm reasonably optimistic, though I will say this. As you said, there's significant amounts of legislation going through. There may be other pieces of legislation that take priority, and I'll be involved in those discussions at that stage. So all these things are in the balance.
Okay, thank you. Right, we're going to move in next to the climate change legislation that we have before us. So we're the last part of these islands to introduce climate change legislation. And it's a bit like buses. We had none, and then all of a sudden 2 pieces of legislation have come along at the same time competing with each other. So we have Bill number 1, the Green Party leader Claire Bailey's bill, known by some as the Bailey Bill, which is supported by all of the executive parties except for the DUP. And then Bill number 2, which is DUP Agriculture Minister Edwin Poote's bill. It's viewed from people that I'm talking to, it's viewed that the first bill is a stronger piece of legislation on emissions. Claire Bailey's bill, which you obviously know a lot about, Anurag, is to establish a net zero carbon, climate resilient and environmentally sustainable economy by the year 2045. With regard to the mission, Edwin Poote's bills is 82% by 2050. The Bailey bill seems like a more ambitious piece of legislation. Why do you think that we must adopt that one over the Minister's bill?
Well, I think first of all, I would say that from the perspective of someone who actually worked on the drafting of the bill that Claire Bailey introduced, it's not really the position that we must have this one or that one. Both bills are at committee stage at the minute. What is finally going to come out is going to be a matter for the Assembly, of course. And what provisions are voted through and which provisions are amended and which amendments are removed by the members. What my concern is, and I think this is something that we all share, is that the legislation that does come forward has to be fit for purpose. And the sort of reasoning behind it, why do we need climate legislation? Because we simply need a legislative footing on which to ground actual climate policies. Now, we've heard this morning, and I'm sure we'll hear throughout the rest of the event today, that different sectors are approaching sustainability and climate change mitigation and adaptation in different ways. But people can only go so far if you don't actually have the legislative backing, both in terms of enabling policy, but also in terms of guiding policy. And this is where, whatever legislation is enacted at Stormont, I certainly hope that there's a strong policy prescription element to that legislation. That is in Bill number 1. It isn't in Bill number 2. Bill number 2 is a very sort of classic UK Climate Change Act style bill. So you have headline emissions reduction targets and carbon emissions figures in the form of carbon budgets, which are then achieved through policies. Now, there are duties on devolved authorities in the second bill to come up with policies, but it is a duty to come up with a policy. What it differs from, in terms of Bill number 1 and the Scottish Climate Change Act, is where both Bill number 1 and the Scottish Act actually prescribe, here are the principles that the policies must hit. Things like just transition. So, trying to decarbonize in a way that actually takes every sector forward and provides for new ways of economic thinking so that we can also deal with social deprivation and poverty alleviation at the same time. We can also focus on gender inequality at the same time as a way of effectively having an economic reset whilst we decarbonize. And it's important that this happens because a sort of, the approach of kind of a deregulated version of decarbonization isn't necessarily proven to be a sustainable one. So there needs to be a strong legislative footing so that we can have policy prescription, and then that can then be enforced as a matter of both legal accountability and political accountability, so that we could talk about any number of cases where this has happened, but courts find it very difficult, for example, to nail a particular policy outcome to a government policy unless the legislation that gives rise to that policy is specific enough. And that's very, very important because we also have seen a rise in climate justice litigation recently. So there is a bit of a disconnect between what you want to achieve through the courts in terms of climate justice, in terms of climate policy, in terms of climate sustainability, and what is actually able to be achieved in the courts in the absence of specific legislation, in the absence of creating explicit duties and principles that actually tell the courts, here is what is permitted. So I think from that perspective, good climate legislation, which is absolutely vital because, the UK Act was 2008. The Scottish Act was 2009. We are still sitting here, over a decade later with nothing. So we've gone past the point where we needed to have done something. We are at a point where we absolutely need to do something and something good. So good climate legislation, I think, is what needs to be delivered by the Assembly.
Okay. And Conor, could you give us some of your reflections on the legislation that's before the Assembly at the minute?
Yes, I entirely agree with what Anurag said. My perspective from this really is as a barrister practicing in planning and environmental law, and it's coming at it from trying to litigate these cases in court. And what Anurag has said about specific targets within legislation which we can actually hold ministers and government to account on politically and in the courts is absolutely critical. And that requires specific targets to be set so that you can go into a court and say, well, this simply hasn't been met. The more broad and general the duties upon the government are, the more broadly drawn the legislation is, the more difficult it is to come before a court and to try and enforce that obligation. And that's what we find in climate litigation is often that the courts are reluctant to intervene in what's quite a political issue unless there is quite a clear obligation that's being breached. So I think it's really about ensuring that we have legislation that we can point to, specific targets that we can point to and enforce both politically and legally moving forward.
Okay. And John, some people have suggested that the second bill is a bit of a filibuster, that we're going to end up with no legislation until the next mandate. Do you think that we'll see perhaps the Minister's bill being prioritised over the private member's bill, or that there'll be some combination, bits and pieces drawn from the legislation, even if that's possible?
Well, we certainly don't want to end this Assembly mandate without climate legislation. And we're co-sponsors of Claire Bailey's bill, and we favour that approach for the reasons that have been outlined today, because there are targets, those targets can be monitored, and more importantly, those targets can be held to account. The second bill coming from Minister Poots was brought kicking and screaming from the Minister because of the intervention of Claire and the other private members. I think now there's a realisation within the DUP that they need to bring forward climate legislation. They haven't reached the point yet where they're bringing forward the proper climate legislation. So there may be a few antics and a few moves before this is all over and done with, but if the Assembly lasts until May 2022, then I believe we will achieve a proper piece of climate legislation moving forward.
Okay. Conor, perhaps you might be able to answer this one, just with regards to Edwin Poots' bill, the 82% by 2050. Do you think that perhaps those in England would indicate they feel that they could be net negative by 2050 to make up for Northern Ireland not being net zero?
I mean, I think, you know, it's ultimately, when you are drawing specific targets like that, there is a huge element of political judgment that has to be reached in terms of what individual areas and countries can contribute. And I think there are certain circumstances in Northern Ireland that might justify, you know, perhaps a different approach being taken to what's being taken in other parts of the United Kingdom or in other parts of the world. So I think it's ultimately, once we get down to the finer detail of targets and percentages, it's about recognising that tackling the climate crisis is about a balance, and there's, you know, economic interests to be taken into account. There's different sector interests that need to be recognised, and all of that needs to be taken into account when coming up with a particular target. And that's ultimately a matter for, you know, politicians to decide where that balance lies, and it might be that it lies slightly differently, or some people might view it slightly less ambitiously in Northern Ireland than it does in other places.
Thank you. And Anna, perhaps you could answer this one, just sort of the difference between the carrot and the stick. I think maybe perhaps COVID has shown us that we can't always rely on everyone to do the right thing. How much do you feel the balance needs to be on having definite law in place against public messaging, and perhaps some of your thoughts on carbon taxes?
Yeah, I think my sort of main point in terms of legislation and in terms of what we tried to put into Bill number 1 was that there has to be public buy-in to the idea of decarbonisation and to the practice of decarbonisation. If there isn't public buy-in, there's no point. And so for public buy-in to be realised, the whole process of setting climate policy has to be as transparent as possible. And it has to have public involvement. And I think that sort of ties into public messaging as well, because if you have a situation where policy is simply set by ministers without much consultation, or without a sort of transparent consultation process, then different sectors, as Conor said, might feel that they're being left out. I mean, we have a huge agri-food sector in this jurisdiction, and you know, you have to consider individual needs of individual sectors, but against the overall point of decarbonisation. So the idea in sort of policy prescription in Bill number 1, for example, is to have the draft of it before the Assembly, and then the Assembly gets to vote on it. There's also a public consultation period before the draft is laid before the Assembly, and the response of that public consultation has to be put before the Assembly. So it is really in the hands of people through elected officials. And this whole process will be played out in the public domain if Bill number 1 passes as it is. So public messaging is hugely important, and public participation is hugely important. This has to be democratically done. In terms of carbon taxes, it's one policy area, certainly. I think one of the problems when it comes to taxation and the Stormont Assembly is we don't have sort of general competence over taxation. And so it gets into the sort of boundaries between what Stormont is capable of legislating under the Northern Ireland Act and what it isn't. And the boundaries have a sort of tendency to shift over time, depending on what courts say and how the legislation is interpreted. So that is an issue. But I think where Northern Ireland's devolved authorities have a lot of competence is really in determining major planks of climate policy, like energy, for example. We have competence over our own energy, which Scotland doesn't. So there is a real need of considering different policy approaches and considering them holistically, but also taking the public with climate policy.
I think it's also important that, to recognise that, companies also have a role to play in this, and there might be a role for legislation in that particular area. Most of the legislation historically has focused on government targets and what the state should be doing, but we're seeing an increasing number of court cases and legislation in other jurisdictions where there are obligations upon companies, for instance, when making financial reports to declare what their climate impacts are, whether we should introduce legislation to that effect, introducing other obligations upon shareholders to consider climate-related issues when they're making decisions. Those are the types of private sector interventions that perhaps we need to be thinking about in the future, because it's not enough, I don't think, to have these quite broad, high-level government targets without actually thinking about how it's going to work through the private sector. And certainly we're seeing a lot more court cases that are involving private companies, whereas typically it would have always been litigation against the state. So I do think there's a role for the private sector and potentially for legislation to step in and impose additional obligations on private sector players within this field.
Okay, and John, you're indicating that you want to say something about it. If you could also maybe address Sinn Féin's position on carbon taxes and the carrot stick approach.
Our view is the same as in all taxes. It depends who's paying it and why, and who can afford to pay it. There's no point in taxing those people who cannot afford to survive in this world further on the basis of reducing carbon emissions or carbon taxes. And it was actually yesterday when the utility regulator was giving his presentation to the Economy Committee and telling us that there's going to be a further gas price rise in December. I said to him, look, there's a lot of conversation about net zero and carbon, and I said there's going to be families this winter who are going to achieve net zero because they aren't going to be able to afford to turn their heating on. So there's no point in talking to those families and telling those families that they need to pay further carbon taxes for net zero. That's the wrong people to tax. So as was said earlier on, in terms of the Climate Bill 1, it has to be about a fair transition and a fair society moving forward, or else there won't be buy-in to it. And we see challenges there for the agricultural community, and fair enough comment earlier on about the production of meat and beef, etc. But it's how you produce the beef is the important question, and how you support those producers of the beef to do it in a different way than they're currently doing it. And we have to also then support communities and families to assist them to move into carbon neutral environments. But we cannot tax those who are already paying the highest tax burden in society for this.
I saw someone online yesterday saying it would be better having fewer cows than feeding them seaweed, which is an interesting point to make. But I think we're going to wrap up in a few minutes. So just some final reflections on Greta Thunberg has made a big impact at the COP conference over in Glasgow with her blah, blah, blah commentary. And she was talking about how activists are going to change the world on the ground rather than the politicians. So we'll maybe start with you on that point, John. Can the Northern Ireland, such a small part of the world, make a big difference? Are we capable of doing it?
Politics should never be left simply to the elected politicians. No matter what area of politics it is, community and activism and people, whether it's through demonstrations, whatever it may be, politics is much broader than simply those who sit up on the hill. I've always believed that. I see myself as a political activist, not as a politician. So never leave politics to the politicians. Always, always be involved in the political forming and shaping of your society.
Conor, are we capable of doing this?
Yeah, I think we are, but I think John's comment is wise. Don't leave it to people up on the hill, and we ultimately have to be responsible for our own actions moving forward. The people on the hill have a very important role in trying to shape our actions and trying to get us there, but it's ultimately going to be individual responsibility and us all making small changes to get us where we need to be.
Okay, and a final comment, final word to you, Anna.
Well, I think John's comment is actually very pertinent here, because Bill number 1 rarely represents one of those genuine partnerships between civic society and politics. The bill was drafted by civic society. The bill had huge inputs from the environmental NGOs, employment justice NGOs, and it was taken up and supported by a number of different parties in the Stormont Assembly. So I hope that partnership can continue. And, you know, we might be late to the game, but we're trying to do something. I genuinely hope we're successful in it.
That's great. Thank you very much, Anna, Conor, and John. Next, we're going to have a short video from Phoenix Gas to show you, and after that, you're going to be joined by Claire Guinness from Innovation City Belfast, who's chairing our next panel. Thank you.
Did you make it, Conor?
Yep, nice.
Nice to meet you.
When you picture Belfast Harbour in your mind, what do you see? A place rich in history, that's been built over generations. A port that Northern Ireland relies on for everyday life. A port that keeps our shops and factories open. A place of business that employs over 27,000 people and that is now the location for both local and global companies. Somewhere that entertains thousands every year and brings tourists from every corner of the world. A place of connection, of innovation, where technology is thriving and we work together for the benefit of all. A place where many of the next generation are supported, educated and mentored to go further faster, to push the boundaries of what's possible. A place where you can eat, meet and dream. A place where heritage and the future come together. Belfast Harbour, a port for everyone.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this panel discussion, where we'll gain an insight into how ports and the maritime sector are embracing the green agenda. 90% of world trade is transported by sea, which in turn is responsible for 3% of CO2 emissions globally. At COP26 this week, 14 countries, including the US, Great Britain, Norway and Denmark, committed to delivering zero emissions in shipping by 2050. But what is being done locally here, and how can we benefit from maritime innovation? I'm delighted to be joined by leaders and specialists in the sector. Firstly, Joe O'Neill, who is the CEO of Belfast Harbour, which handles 70% of Northern Ireland's seaborne trade and 20% of Ireland's. I'm also joined virtually by Jerry Hallisey, the head of business development. Sorry, I'm obsessed with Belfast. The head of business development at Shannon Foynes Port, the largest bulk handling port in Ireland, who are investing €250 million to become an offshore renewable hub. And I'm also joined by Maria Boss. She's with us, and she is the CEO of Norwegian shore power company Plug, who design, build and operate shore power facilities to assist ports with the reduction of both emissions and energy consumption. It would feel most appropriate to start with Joe, as Belfast Harbour was the first port in the world to achieve carbon neutral status. It sources all its energy from renewables and delivered a 27% reduction in carbon emissions last year. Joe, perhaps you would summarise your commitment to sustainability and the key projects that are underway.
Thank you, Claire. First of all, I'll probably just start by saying we're delighted to be one of the sponsors for Belfast Homecoming Green Edition, so I hope it's a wonderful event for everyone. I suppose, point of clarification at the outset as well. Yes, we achieved carbon neutral status way back in 2008. Seems a lifetime ago, and almost ahead of all of the current momentum towards carbon neutral and zero carbon. We did that substantially through offsetting. We did obviously look at our existing processes and see how we could reduce our emissions, but it was achieved through offsetting. We have an entirely different lens on that now. It's not using offsetting to achieve net zero carbon by 2030, and hopefully much earlier than that if we can, but working really hard to reduce and eradicate our emissions. I think as an organisation we're in a good place at this moment in time with regard to our strategy, our ambition and our emissions. We actually have very low emissions from our so-called Scope 1 and Scope 2 activities, and we can identify very clearly where we do emit carbon and where we can take mitigating action to remove that by 2030 or earlier. So, as you would expect, we've got a very robust sustainability strategy in place to support one of our 5 strategic themes, which is to be a leading green port. In parallel with that, and in a very public commitment last year, we entered into a prosperity agreement with the Department of Agriculture and Environment, which largely mirrors what we say we intend to do through our sustainability strategy. That will be tracked in a very public manner by the department and by other stakeholders with regard to delivery against our commitments. We've framed our sustainability strategy through 6 lenses. There's decarbonisation, as I've said. Mostly comes through our Scope 1 and Scope 2 activities related to operating our cranes and our pilot boats. We're already actively trialling alternative fuels for those, and I would hope within a couple of years we can remove all carbon emissions from those trading activities. We already buy all of our electricity from renewable electricity sources, so we're in a good place with regard to early achievement of decarbonisation for our core activities. I'll return to the wider estate and the wider port family in a minute. Green Developer then is the next leg of our sustainability strategy. Hopefully everyone in the room and those viewing online will have picked up that all of our announcements with regards to our substantial real estate investments are done and reported through a BREEAM Excellent accreditation. So we are aiming for the highest level of sustainability certification for our built product. BREEAM Excellent, we think it's just a minimum entry point now for offering real estate. We do that for our offices and have been doing that for some time. Some of you may be aware we are planning a major expansion of our film studios. There has never been a BREEAM Excellent film studio developed. We are going to be the first. We've incorporated that into the tender documents that we have out at the minute for those studios. So we're pushing the boundaries into new asset classes for sustainability. We have then looked at One Planet Living certification for our City Keys Gardens, the new major green space that we announced about a month ago in and around the harbour area. So a lot of sustainability incorporated into our Green Developer ambitions. Next leg is on biodiversity and the thriving maritime ecosystem. About 400 acres of the harbour estate is actually allocated to nature conservation lands. Incredibly important that we maintain those lands, work with the other partner agencies like our SBB, etc., to maintain and enhance those lands. We're looking at biodiversity audits at the minute and working with Ulster Wildlife Trust to maximise our biodiversity and improve our marine ecosystem. Linked to that then, clearly we have 2,000 acres of land bank and we have 1,000 acres of water. Clean air and water quality is hugely fundamental to our business. So we're looking at ways of how we can improve the air quality and reduce emissions from our handling activities, principally for dry bulk commodities. We're looking at how we improve the clean water within and achieve higher clean water status within the harbour estate and within the harbour water areas. And we're looking very importantly at sustainable transport. We have a major piece of work underway for sustainable transport strategy for the entirety of the state, but starting within Queen's Island. New cycleways, pedestrian ways, etc. Resource efficiency is our next area. Procuring sustainably and removing any waste to off-site. We have 92% recycling at the minute for the organisation, so well on track to achieve 100% recycling and looking at the green circular economy. And then the final piece, speaking to the wider estate, is we have 760 businesses here. We have, as you saw in the video there, 27,000 people here. That's a big stakeholder base. A lot of them will have sustainability ambitions, will have sustainability impacts. So we want to work with them and inspire and engage and transform their activities so that the power of the multiples is greater than us all acting individually. And we see a strong advocacy voice and encouragement and engagement voice with our wider estate. So it's a really active agenda. It's a busy agenda, as hopefully you can see. It's multifaceted, but we're delighted with how the strategy is going, and we're very open to being assessed at how we're delivering that, and that's largely reflected through the Prosperity Agreement.
Thanks very much, Joe. It certainly wasn't easy to articulate all of that in a few minutes. It's a very broad and wide agenda, as you say. And I suppose thinking of Belfast Harbour, it is one of Belfast's largest and most successful landowners. And I suppose in that, Joe, how would you've touched on it already a bit, but how would you sort of say that you're leveraging those assets for the socio-economic development of Northern Ireland?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. We do have one of our themes to be a leading socially responsible port. That's a different language than we would have talked about, say, even 18 months ago, 2 years ago. We very much reported our activities successfully. Yes, we have to be, as a commercial organisation, we have to be financially successful. But we otherwise reported through economic lens of jobs created, GVA, added value to the economy, etc. We now recognise that we do have a much wider impact than just jobs and GVA. We touch on a large part of the Belfast in terms of the bordering communities. We have a major social impact from all of our activities, our investments, our trading, our community, widespread community support. So we've developed this social value strategy called Leading Social Responsible Port. We actually just commissioned and have just received the first draft of a report from Turley's measuring that social value, which we're taking through with the board now to see what further initiatives we can develop. But it is a priority now for us to look at our social outcomes as much as our economic outcomes for our activities, because we simply realise the scale of the assets we control, the scale of our activities, we do have a profound effect from both social, economic and environmental.
Very good, thank you. And of course it would be remiss not to mention the Innovation District, Joe, because you've obviously committed a huge lot of resource and indeed acreage to the encourage innovation and build on the Belfast Region City deals here, which is another key aspect, I think, of the port's positive impact.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Joe. I'd now like to move from the eastern seaboard of Ireland over to the western, and wondered, Jerry, if you could tell us about your ambitions to develop Shannon Foynes to become the marshalling port for hydrogen in Ireland.
Thank you, Claire, and thank you, I suppose, to Martin and all those who organised this terrific event. In some respects, when I'm not actually there, it feels like a return to my roots from the time back in the early 80s when I worked up with Sean McCready from the Doyle Shipping Group for Bell Lines up on the Boucher Road at the Northern Ireland Rail Freight Terminal there many, many moons ago. So great to be back in this virtual capacity. I suppose just a little bit of context about Shannon Foynes Port. We're a commercial semi-state company owned by the Department of Transport here in the south, statutory authority for the 500 square kilometre Shannon Estuary, which is one of the deepest and most sheltered waterways in the world, outside of, in a European context, outside of Rotterdam. I believe we rank second from those criteria. We're Ireland's largest bulk port, dealing with about 11 million tonnes of cargo a year, and we facilitate trade in the region of about 13 billion annually. We're a Tier 1 port under Ireland's port policy, and more importantly, I suppose we're a 10T core corridor port on the North Sea Mediterranean corridors and on the Atlantic corridor. I suppose in the context of the Atlantic corridor that we have an awful lot of ambition in relation to hydrogen and ammonia. The Atlantic resource was put this year by Wind Europe at being in excess of 85 gigawatts. That's a pretty amazing resource when you consider that Ireland's actual requirement, domestic requirement, is somewhere between 5.5 and 7.5 gigawatts. So 10 times that size is a substantial resource. The route to market opportunities in relation to that are obviously not as clear. The domestic grid obviously can only cater for so much, and hence why we as the Port Authority started looking at the potential for how we might be able to step up to the plate as part of an overall decarbonisation effort within the estuary. I suppose traditionally when you've got two fossil burning power stations in the estuary, you've got one of the world's largest aluminium smelting facilities
and you've got a cement manufacturing facility in the estuary, it doesn't lead to having a great reputation from a carbon point of view. But we think we can turn that on its head over the next number of years and are working strongly in that regard to even make the negatives a positive as we move forward. The big opportunity, I think, there is in the storage and possibly export potential of hydrogen and the electrofuels suite of products, as there will be both from an aircraft refueling facility at Shannon Airport with sustainable aviation fuels, but also from, you mentioned earlier, Claire, about the industry desire to reduce the 3% cost to carbon by 2050 of the shipping industry. And a lot of what the industry is talking with, and we've spoken with pretty much all of them at this stage, is the desire to transition to carbon-free fuels. And from that point of view, they need what I loosely describe a filling station right about where the Shannon estuary is. So we're positioning ourselves in that regard to not only be a filling station for the larger vessels that would transit across the North Atlantic, but also the move towards greener, more environmentally friendly short sea shipping routes, so that from the Shannon estuary, you'll be able to, in the years to come, have short sea shipping routes down into the Mediterranean or up into the Baltic, or even to any of the western seaboards of ports of Europe. So we're trying to bring all that together. It's not going to be an easy accomplishment, but I think it's certainly achievable, and we have a 10-year timeline built in for that process, part of which is the building of a new, you mentioned the 250 million euro spend by the Port Authority. We're building a new deep water terminal here in Foynes that will facilitate the largest vessels in the world to be able to come alongside. The estuary itself can already take Cape-size vessels for domestic and other purposes there, but we're looking to be able to take the largest vessels on any routing deep into the heart of the estuary, which is completely uncongested, and be able to refuel them with replacement fuels for the future, green fuels, and also to be able to assist in that cargo decarbonisation effort.
That's a huge plan, Jerry, 10-year plan, and a massive amount of expenditure too committed to that, so it's great to hear. And I suppose just a connection here to Belfast, I mean, Ulster University and Queen's University have really got some groundbreaking innovation in the storage and transportation of hydrogen, so I shall link you up, Jerry, afterwards to a few people that might be able to help with your endeavours. And I suppose it is a collective endeavour, and that's the point. And I guess when it comes to that, Jerry, you'd mentioned that you were working with other countries in Europe, and it'd be useful just to touch on some of that work, just to give that wider context.
Yeah, I suppose, I mean, the island of Ireland as a whole has never had a resource that it could exploit to the same extent that wind energy, I suppose, the potential that offers. So in looking and examining and putting together a developmental plan for the future, I suppose it's in all our best interests that we identify our own shortcomings and where we have the need for the assistance of others. And from the early stages, we started reaching out to other European member states and other states outside the European Union that could help us deliver that resource. And I suppose the North Sea has always been the inspirational leader when it would come to offshore energy. And as part of that, we reached out to the industry associations in Holland and in Denmark, and more especially, I suppose, in Norway. And we've had an awful lot of collaboration with the Norwegian Offshore Energy Cluster, with the Norwegian Energy Partners. And the embassy in Dublin here has been absolutely fantastic when it has come to facilitating introductions to companies that have long established reputations in this regard. And it has been proved to be a great assistance to us and of great help to us as part of the formulation of our plan, and hopefully as the implementation of it in the years to come.
Thanks very much, Jerry. And it is interesting and very handy that you mentioned Norway, because I would like to now introduce Maria, whose business designs, implements and operates shore power solutions for ports. And Maria, could you just outline the benefits of those shore power to sustainability?
Thank you so much, Claire, and thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today. It's a great honour. We'd very much like to be there in person, hopefully next time. So with regards to shore power, we definitely believe that is a part of the solution for a more sustainable shipping industry. As talked about here, there's definitely a need for a zero emission fuel at sea, but we believe that shore power will be a competitive alternative while at berth. And it's also a known technology, and we've sort of proven that it works. So that's why my company both invests and works with shore power and also partners up with ports in order to speed up the construction of this necessary infrastructure. For those of you who are not very familiar with shore power, a typical shore power facility consists of a transformer and a frequency converter and some switchgear and a cable management systems to hoist the cables aboard the ship. And that enables the ships to connect to the grid instead of using the generators aboard. And through this, we can reduce both local emissions and noise, which is important, of course. And then depending on the energy mix at the end of the grid, it may also contribute to decarbonize the shipping industry. So from our perspective, when we talk to ports around both Norway and Europe, we see that there are two things that they struggle with when it comes to shore power. It's typically funding and trying how to finance this, because it could be a big investment and it's a big decision to build this type of infrastructure. And then obviously also, I mean, electrical installations are not really at the core of port operations and knowledge. So they need help deciding and figuring out what to build, because there are so many different types of ships, and you need to know if it's going to be high voltage or low voltage. There are lots of things to consider. And being in such a big investment, you need to be sure that you build the right thing. So basically what Plug does is that we bring both funding and knowledge to the table. And we partner with ports, typically structured through joint ventures. And together we build and own and operate these shore power facilities, sharing both the investment, the risk, and the future profit. And we believe that, you know, partnerships and cooperation is a way to speed up the development of this type of infrastructure.
Very good. Thank you, Maria. I think it's great that you've integrated actually the model so much, because it's one thing having a great idea of how you're going to reduce emissions, but it's another thing trying to find the money to finance it. And so that sounds like a sensible model. I suppose just when we've got you, Maria, in terms of the approach of Norway overall, they seem to have quite a, you know, an ambitious and forward-looking approach to the green energy and decarbonisation. Would you have anything you'd like to share with us in terms of the overall country's approach?
So yes, I mean, I'm often asked why Norway is so much at the forefront, especially when it comes to shore power. And actually, I just took a quick overview of all the ports in the world that have some type of shore power capability. And actually, as of today, 45% of those ports are in Norway. And that's very good for Norway, but it's really sad in a global perspective. So we definitely need to speed up this. But it also means that in Norway, we have a unique experience with shore power, both from port side, from the side of the ships, and also from the shipping operators. And when I'm asked, you know, why have we succeeded so much in Norway, I think it's obvious that the fact that we've had an economic support scheme supporting both the building of infrastructure, but also retrofit of ships, has had an enormous impact on how many shore power facilities that has been built in Norway.
Oh, that's great. So obviously the economic influence there and the policy has driven it, which is hopefully a good lesson for us here in Northern Ireland. I'm sure I speak for all the participants when I say that I've really enjoyed hearing about your activities and your ambitions in respect of the race to net zero. It's clear that our maritime assets are not only in safe hands, but they're in green hands too. So thank you very much to all the participants, and thanks very much for listening.
Morning, and I'm delighted to say our next panel is all around a new era in green buildings, and we're very fortunate to have Debbie Caldwell chairing it for us today. Debbie, if you don't already know, is the Climate Commissioner for Belfast City Council, and we are hugely, hugely fortunate to have her. If you take an opportunity to look at her biography, she's led design and delivery of climate change initiatives all across Bangladesh, Nigeria and Rwanda. And to recognise her skills, she'll also be one of the recipients of the Belfast Ambassador Medals this evening. Before we start that panel, we'll be seeing a short video from TransLink.
Climate change is happening. It affects everyone, and we must all act now to cut our carbon emissions.
TransLink is taking urgent action through its transformational climate positive strategy.
This means it will adopt a net zero approach to delivering its services
and introduce cleaner, greener buses and trains to the TransLink fleet. The climate positive strategy will help our environment and deliver better services.
It will also help our health and improve the economy. So here's TransLink's promise to us all.
They're going to cut their carbon emissions in half by 2030 and reach net zero carbon emissions by 2040.
That's 10 years ahead of the UK government's net zero target. It's a tough goal to reach, but TransLink intends to keep its promise.
They've already started the journey towards a greener future with the rollout of zero-emission buses and plans to decarbonise the entire rail network. TransLink has lots of buildings, offices and workshops, plus bridges, tunnels and platforms. How can their carbon footprint be reduced?
TransLink's working on that. They're looking at greener ways to design, build and use their buildings and structures so they enhance our health and well-being and protect the world around us.
Taking these actions now means that TransLink is well on track to reach its targets and be climate positive by 2050. Public transport is the backbone of a healthy region. TransLink's ambition is to be a cleaner, greener business, protecting the environment, improving biodiversity, reducing waste and water use, while still offering high levels of safety and comfort.
Makes it easy to make the bus and train
your first choice for travel today or tomorrow. Climate change is happening now. We must protect our world, so choose cleaner, greener public transport.
Let's change together.
Well, thanks very much. It's a real pleasure to be here today, and thanks very much for the opportunity to come, and a very warm welcome to our panel. I think we've got one of our panelists is here remotely. Aoife Julian Weiberg is a professor of architecture at Ulster University. She's worked in Norway as well as the UK and the Bahamas. And we've got Patrick O'Gorman here with us today. We're very fortunate. He's the principal with Bywater Properties, which is a development and investment company, and they're doing some really interesting green buildings across Belfast. And we've also got Grania Long here, who is the chief executive with the Northern Ireland Housing Executive, which is a statutory housing authority for Northern Ireland. So really good that you could join us all today. Green buildings is really, really topical and really, really important. I don't know if you're aware, but like 65% of all the greenhouse gas emissions in Belfast come from buildings, and that's just from the use of buildings. That doesn't include the construction and all the embodied carbon that you get in buildings. So really, really critical that we green our buildings in terms of reaching our net zero ambitions and commitments across the city. And you guys are really at the forefront of all of this, so really, really looking forward to hearing from you all today. Aoife, I wonder if we could just kind of start perhaps with you. I know you've worked for like 10 years in Norway with the Zero Emission Buildings Research Centre. I wonder if you can just tell us a little bit about that, and how do you design a net zero building? Is it possible to get down to net zero?
Yes, absolutely. Before I actually answer that specific question, I want to actually frame
the fact that, you know, buildings account for 40% of the total greenhouse gas emissions, which actually is lower than what you're saying is the situation in Northern Ireland, so it makes it even more critical. And just to point out as well, when we talk about embodied carbon, what we're actually talking about is we're describing the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the whole life cycle. So all the emissions associated with production, operation and demolishing of buildings. So to meet our climate mitigation needs, we really need to shift our focus from the traditional approach on just operational emissions and shift it to life cycle emissions of buildings. So really, just to put it in a bit of context, zero emission buildings are one of the main climate mitigation strategies to combat climate change. So coming to the research centre, the vision of the research centre of zero emission buildings was to eliminate greenhouse gas emissions across the whole life cycle by 2030. And the main objective was to develop solutions which were competitive and could be implemented into the mainstream for both existing and new buildings, so that could lead to market penetration of buildings that would have net zero across the life cycle. So what has been done already, there are 9 pilot projects that have actually been built around Norway. And this is really important because these pilots serve as an innovation hub and they involve strong interdisciplinary cooperation between researchers, building professionals, property developers, municipalities. And it really allows us to test new solutions for constructing, operating, and using buildings that have net zero across their life cycle. So
that's really interesting. And it's great to see that there's all these advances that are going on. I'm just wondering, how does this work actually in practice? Patrick, you've been at the forefront of this. I know in London you're actually planning a new building, a net zero building. I think it's fair to say it's the first net zero building in central London. How are you going about this? What's involved?
Well, Aoife mentioned in terms of, there's been a lot of work historically on operational carbon and reducing the footprint of operational carbon. I think we're actually, over the last decade, we've made quite significant advances with that, particularly as the power grid becomes a lot more renewable. I think when we approached this specific building called Paradise in London, which is a 60,000 square foot office building, we wanted to do something to reduce the embodied carbon of and when you look at the life cycle carbon footprint, the big carbon burp is the construction element of it. That's where the real damage is done. And then everything from there is actually a relatively small amount. So what we wanted to try and do was reduce that damage within that construction build. So when we looked at it and spoke with our design team and our engineers, it was clear that the best way of doing that was reducing the steel and the concrete content of the build, and the alternative to that is timber. So as you can see here, so we've done timber structure, predominantly timber structure scheme, CLT and glulam mix. And to give you some benchmarks, to build a new office building, you're looking at about 1,000, in regular steel and concrete, steel or concrete, you're looking at about 1,000 kilograms of carbon per square meter. The REBA 2030 challenge is 500 kilos of carbon per square meter. This scheme is 268. So we are a quarter of what it currently takes to build, and pretty much half of the REBA challenge. So that's what we've looked at. Now we are due to be starting that in January. There's obviously, it's provoked a lot of interest. A lot of people have been thinking about timber in office buildings, and there's been quite a lot of challenges put forward, which we feel we've overcome and are overcoming. So yeah, we're very excited about that.
It's a fantastic looking building. I like that idea of like reducing the burp and bringing that down. And it's great that we have these kind of landmark buildings, because it really challenges other developers to do what you're doing. I think it's really, really good. I'm wondering just what does this actually look like in the social housing sector? You know, we have this sort of fantastic, lovely landmark building, but then when you get down to social housing, what does that look like? And in terms of, you know, just the new build in social housing sector, I mean, you're leading the housing exec, you're shaping the whole tomorrow of social housing. What is housing stock in the social sector going to look like tomorrow?
Well, we want it to be radically different from how it looks today. Debbie, to be frank, I mean, I'm very clear, the Housing Executive is the strategic housing authority. So while we don't currently build, we administer the building of 1,900 homes. So this year, 162 million, we'll spend 162 million on new social housing, 1,900 starts this year. And I use the same line time and again, as often as I can. Every time we build something that's not net zero, we're adding to the problem. And so all of those 1,900 homes that are not net zero, we will have to retrofit in their lifetime. Now, that's not good use of public money. So there's a huge amount of work ahead across the social housing sector, not unique to Northern Ireland. I have to say, I have to do some work still across the water in England in a housing association, and all social landlords right now are looking at how we radically decarbonise not just our existing stock, but just for the purpose of this conversation, our new build. So a huge amount to do. I think we can learn a huge amount actually from, we need to be looking at buildings across the piece. So I don't see social housing as separate from the wider debate on buildings, and I think it's really important that we look at all the technologies that are available to us. But just to focus for a moment on Northern Ireland and what we're doing, I mean, this year, for the first time, the Housing Executive will build, and we will build 6 properties using modern methods of construction, and we will use those 6 properties as an opportunity to build as low carbon a development as possible. So we're very excited about that. Now, 6 is a very small number, but 6 is the opportunity for us to move rapidly this year to look at what's the technology available to us, how ready is the construction industry. That's a very, very, very critical piece for us. We're on a small island, and I think, I certainly take the view that we need to be bold, we need to be ambitious, we need to be very, very clear that it's our intention to be building to net zero standards in this decade. And Debbie, you've heard me say this many times, this is the decade. I mean, we have to be doing this now, we have to be doing it this year, next year, the following year. So I think it's important that my organisation is saying to the industry, we are intent on doing this. We now need you to ramp up. We need you to build your capacity. We need you to build your skills. I think if I had a concern, it's actually less about the money, less about the technology, and much, much more about the standards, the building standards that are required, but probably more so skills and capacity within the industry. And that's not meant in a negative sense. That's really meant, it's also an industry that's dealing with a whole range of other issues right now. I mean, I'll come on to retrofit if you want me to, but as I say, to get to net zero, we need a whole range of things to happen at the same time.
No, I think we can come to retrofit. That's fantastic to see that level of leadership in the public sector, but also in the private sector is really, really encouraging, because we really need this to happen, and we need those emissions to come right down, like Ronja said, in the next 10 years. Patrick, you're an investor, right? You're a developer. What are your biggest frustrations in terms of getting projects like this off the ground? What do you think needs to change?
Well, I use timber as an example, because when we approached Paradise and looked at it from a timber perspective, we assumed that everyone else would know more than us, and we assumed that there were reasons why it wasn't being done. And there weren't that many people that knew a lot more about it than us, and there weren't that many reasons why it hadn't been done before. So there's a lot of assumptions made, well, we can't do timber because of fire, right? Let's get it out there, fire. There are plenty of ways to mitigate that risk. And actually, timber is not that bad in terms of fire, and it can be managed accordingly and appropriately. And obviously with Grenfell, we're very aware of that. But there are very clear ways of reducing those risks. So I think the first thing we do, and it's great to hear Gráinne say that from a different perspective, we've got to, as the investors or the developers, the clients, we need to push it. We need to push it really hard, because other than that, it's quite easy for consultants, lenders, councils just to say, no but, we can't do it but because of this, and put barriers in front of us. And it's our job to say, there is a way forward here. We are going to find the way forward, and you guys, the experts, are going to help us. And I think that maybe is probably the second frustration that I've personally had, is we have some brilliant minds, some brilliant experts who know so much about building. And what I've found the challenge is putting those minds together to come up with a positive mentality about how we can do this, how we can get net zero. And I think that's my challenge as the developer and the investor, is setting the target and pushing and pushing and pushing until we get there. And I think the biggest change that we've seen, even in the last 2 years actually, but I think it's a demographic change. I think the key movement is the youth, because the people that want to live in these buildings, the people that want to work in the offices, the people working in the professional consultancy companies, they are so passionate about this, and that's changing. And therefore, if you're not building net zero carbon, or if you're not offering that as a skill set within your cost consultancy company or engineering consultancy company, you're not going to get people occupying the buildings, you're not going to get people working for your companies. So I think it is changing no matter what, because the youngsters are pushing for change, and I think that's fantastic.
Yeah. And I think that's where, sorry to interrupt, but just to echo Patrick's point, I mean, I've been in a number of conversations in the last couple of years where I've been really struck by advisors, whether it's construction advisors or housing advisors, who have actively said to me, just wait, don't lead, let other organisations take the risk, let them put the risk on their balance sheet of investing in the wrong way. I've been really shocked, actually, and there's been a number of occasions, not in this job, in previous and other roles, where I've had to say, I'm not working with that organisation, they're not providing me with the advice and the leadership. So you're absolutely right, Patrick. I think organisations like ours have to step up and say, we're going to do this, you either come with us and you will benefit from that, or don't. But frankly, that's what we're intent on doing, and I think you're absolutely right. The advice needs to come from those organisations on the basis that we're doing it, not we're going to be laggards. And I think that's more than we realise. That's out there. I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's really inspiring to hear you both speak. I mean, I feel like we need to clone you because there is a lot of negativity out there, and there's a lot of people that are just hunting around for the problem and the reason not to do things, and it's so reassuring and refreshing to hear people that are really, really positive about that. So I just want to come to retrofitting now, because I know this is a huge issue in Belfast. We've got a lot of really, really old buildings all the way across the city, really poorly insulated, a lot of people still using oil boilers. I mean, it's a massive challenge. And I think it's fair to say you have about 84,000 properties with the housing set across Northern Ireland. That's a pretty significant carbon footprint that you have there. I mean, how do you go about where do you start when you've got to retrofit that many houses? How do you do it? What's a typical retrofit going to look like? How much is this going to cost, and how are you going to finance it all?
Yeah. Huge questions and huge challenges. I mean, I suppose first of all by saying we're going to do it. And I think that's the point I think all three of us have made today, is being really clear this is not a nice to do, it's not something that's optional, we have to do it, and we're not going to wait until 2040 to do it, so we're locking ourselves on a path in this decade. 85,000 homes, and the Housing Executive is still the largest public sector landlord in the UK, in fact I would say in Europe. We're a public sector landlord, we're not a housing association, and yes, our stock is old, and it's getting older every year, and so therefore every year that passes that we don't start this at scale is another year where it will become exponentially more expensive, and we miss the opportunity. So we've been doing a number of pieces of work, and in fact we are retrofitting 1,900 homes this year and next year across Belfast. I could take you up to North Belfast and show you a number of streets where we are undertaking retrofit right now, and I think first of all what we found is residents love it, and once we sit down and we talk to tenants and we say this is what this is going to mean, this is how your house will feel, this is how it will function, what do you think, get them involved at the earliest possible stages. What we've actually found is we have streets of housing streets where some of the homes are owned by us and some have been bought over the years, former housing executive homes, and we're actually finding that the tenants in the homes that bought their homes maybe 10, 20 years ago are now saying to us, could you not do this for us, please? So we're now getting, the demand for retrofit is growing, and that's fantastic to see, 10 minutes up the road, to see tenants and residents saying, we want this, we want it now. We're seeing warmer homes, we're seeing lower fuel bills, and so on. So retrofitting, Fabric First is really important. Aoife is the expert, she knows this far more than I, but coming at this from a Fabric First point of view is really important, but also are the energy systems that sit within the homes. And I think what I'm also finding are small but really, really important pilots ongoing within the Housing Executive and in partnership with other organisations. Large numbers of homes, as you say, Debbie, still off the gas grid, still oil boilers, and we have a number of pilots looking now at heat pumps in Fermanagh, in rural parts of Northern Ireland, where we're working, but again, very much led by the tenant. How do you use your home? How does your home function? What works for you? So I'm very, very, I have to say, very optimistic about it. But final point, it is going to cost an absolute fortune. Right. It's going to be just over 9 billion to retrofit about 580,000 homes in Northern Ireland. That's not just housing executive stock, that's entirely. So we're probably looking at about 1.5 to 2 billion in relation to our stock. But if we see that in a negative way, we'll all just roll our eyes and say, right, we'll never get there. If we think about it differently, and we think that's £9.2 billion worth of investment that will happen here, that will mean investment in our communities, in our supply chains, in the construction industry, not to mention the fact that it will make us more resilient to the effects of climate change. It will make us less dependent on fossil fuels that we're importing, so we're still a net importer of fossil fuels. So, you know, that flip that we will do in this generation, I'd love to say in this decade, but let's say in this generation, I think will transform our economy and make people's lives better. That's fundamentally what this is all about.
Yeah, yeah, and I think the point you make there about cost and actually turning that cost into an investment opportunity and getting those financial flows into those retrofitting area. I mean, it's a key area for us. I mean, you know fully how what a challenge it is for the council. I mean, we have 200 really old buildings, like City Hall, that we are going to have to retrofit and bring into the modern age, and that's like hugely challenging. So, you know, really keen to learn from what you're doing over in the housing exec. Patrick, I just wanted to come back to you because I know you've done some really interesting refurbishments across Belfast, and where you have actually kind of retained that skin of the building and then like refurbished, remodernised, and how do you do that, and how can we get more developers to kind of take that approach instead of just pulling down the building and building a new one?
It was interesting hearing it from your perspective as the council and the housing executive, because obviously when we're looking at making a new investment, we're looking at what price we pay for it, ultimately how much money we're going to put into it, and then what it's worth at the end. And so there is obviously a certain amount of market practice and market forces that come into play on that. Now, in terms of what we've done in Belfast and Donegal Place, which is the Boots building on Donegal Place, which most people refer to it as, those offices have been left empty for 10 years, and all the uppers. And I think uppers in retail, high streets, I think is a really good point, because high streets obviously right now are really struggling at the moment, and they need to be put back into use. Now, we looked at that, and there were a couple of options. We could demolish, get some more height, get some more massing, and rebuild it. But again, the carbon footprint was enormous, and it was completely unnecessary. We've got a fantastic building there with huge floor to ceiling, lots of natural light. So the most commercial way of approaching it, and also the environmentally friendly way, is to refurbish it. And to go back to those numbers again, £1,000 just again for a brand new build, 500 for Rebirth Challenge. We refurbished Donegal Place at 70 kilos of carbon a square metre. So dramatic reduction from a new build. And ultimately what we're doing is we're putting life back into the high street. So, and commercially it works, I should add, because, you know, I am a privately owned, privately run investor, and it needs to make commercial sense, but it does work commercially, because ultimately what you need to do, and this is the way we're approaching all of our refurbishment projects, is when we're looking at this existing building, how much do we really need to throw away? And again, this is where it comes to challenging consultants again, because the typical assumption is you go in there, you wipe it all out, you gut it, and you put some new stuff in again. Now, if you look at those floor tiles, it's like, they don't need to be thrown out. They've got another 30, 40 years of them. You look at that ducting, that's got another 50 years of life in it. And you really need to cut through every single piece of equipment in that building and go, right, what does need to be changed? And then how do we recycle it or reuse it properly? And what can we keep in? Now, the cost-wise, that probably works out about the same, because it is a fiddly job, difficult job, to try and get contractors on board to do this. You really need to get their buy-in and their passion and inspiration on it as well, so that they really understand why we're doing it. Because again, the easy answer is just get rid of it all and start again. So, and I think actually, again, coming back to the commercial aspects, we are very transparent, because we've done the same in London, Manchester, Glasgow, Liverpool, and Belfast. We're very transparent to potential occupiers about the carbon story, the sustainability story, and the advantage about coming into the building. And what we've seen is we've actually been interviewed in the last 2 years by more than a dozen tenants about our green credentials on the building before they even look round the building to think of it as a place to go. So I think going forward, if you are not providing a green, sustainable low carbon building, you're not going to get occupiers for it, and therefore it's not commercial. So hopefully those market forces are working, which is encouraging investors, developers to do it anyway. And if they don't do it, they're going to be left behind.
Yeah, well, let's hope so. I mean, that's great to see that going on. We've spoke quite a lot about kind of like on a building by building basis. Aoife, I wonder if I could just come back to you, because I know you've been doing a lot of work at the kind of neighbourhood level, and particularly around zero emission neighbourhoods. I know you worked for a long time on this in Norway, and it works really well in Norway. Could you just maybe tell us a bit about how that might work here in Belfast?
Yes, so just to sort of introduce what do we mean when we talk about a zero emission neighbourhood. It's very important because the thinking has now shifted in Norway from building scale to neighbourhood scale, because typically you can have, it's very difficult to achieve sometimes, you know, a net zero emission balance in a building that maybe is listed and you can't retrofit to a certain standard. However, if you start to shift the thinking to reducing emissions at a neighbourhood scale or just looking for opportunities within a block, then we have that potential to reduce emissions at a greater scale. So this is really part of a way to transition to a low carbon society, by shifting the thinking from emission reduction from building scale to neighbourhood scale. So what do we mean by a zero emission neighbourhood? Well, firstly, to understand that it's not just one building. We're talking about a group of interconnected buildings so that we can share energy between the buildings. We can locate renewable technologies on several of the buildings. And this also helps to reduce the emissions at the direct scale, so at the building itself, or it may be connected with lower emission, like an offshore wind farm, for example, so that we can reduce emissions for a greater period. So the other thing to point out is that with, you know, whether they're zero emission buildings or neighbourhoods, the thinking is different. We're not talking about buildings and neighbourhoods that consume energy. We're talking about ones that prosume. They become prosumers. So they're producing a lot more energy than they actually need. So this aspect of net zero is very important because you're connecting to the grid. So that way, when you're producing more energy, you're exporting that surplus to the grid. So you're helping to decarbonize at a national scale. So that's really important. So firstly, you know, to have that net connection, shifting thinking from energy only, but thinking to a whole life cycle approach. And this will really help us in our decarbonisation efforts. So just to let you know as well, we have 8 pilot projects that have been built around Norway. So again, that idea of transferring the knowledge from research to industry and offering these lighthouses that you know, potentially will help industry partners to understand how to deliver net zero approaches. And I just wanted to really end up, because Martin had asked me before, well, yeah, that's all well and good, but you know, how do you actually, what does that mean for Northern Ireland? And that really got me thinking, because we have, for example, 2 things which I'd just like to point out. One approach is we have a localised effort where within the university we have, I'm running a studio called Zero Belfast. And what we're doing there is we're taking the research from Norway and embedding it in our architect studio, where we have architects from year 1 to year 6. So these are the architects of the future. They're exposed to state-of-the-art research. They get that knowledge in their head through front-loaded research, and then they start developing strategies in and around Belfast. So what we've done is with Gráinne and Belfast City Council, we're so grateful to have some funding, because we've developed a project called Architects of Change, where the students who now have the knowledge on net zero are developing a training manual, which will then be delivered in a series of workshops to local leaders around the city. So it's only a pilot, and of course we're going to learn through our mistakes. And then just a second point I wanted to just add is that The work in Norway is part of a much bigger international effort which I'm involved in, which is the International Energy Agency Annex 72, where we're working with assessing life cycle related environmental impacts caused by buildings. So this work, like I said, is part of a much bigger body of research. And that research isn't sort of just staying in the ivory tower. What we're doing is that we have 28 different countries. I'm one of the UK national experts. And what we're looking is to then...
That's really interesting, thanks. Sorry to cut you off there, but I think we're out of time at this end. But I just wanted to give a really big thank you to you. Thanks very much to all of our panel here. Thanks, Aoife, thanks, Patrick, and thanks, Grania, and thanks very much to our audience for listening to us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Being the Chief Executive of Young Enterprise, so I'm delighted to hear you talking about that passion from young people and to hear about the architects being trained up in the role of young people. And as part of that, I'm really looking forward to the next talk from Paul Carson, which is around the game-changing investment he has made in solar and battery energy. Obviously, it's fantastic to hear all of this discussion today, but for the young people that I work with, it's really about seeing what economic opportunities it's going to create for them, and this is going to be a fantastic story around entrepreneurship. So, Paul, thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks very much. I'm taking it you're including me in young, which is very much appreciated. Strategic Power Projects is delighted to support the event today. And I have to say, Marcin has once again pulled together a tremendous event, and this morning has been fascinating. Strategic Power Projects has been set up over the last few years to develop utility scale battery storage, solar PV, and anaerobic digestion for biomethane production. Sean Kelly, in his welcoming address, said when the wind blows, some people build walls and some people build windmills. Well, in 2010, I started a business called Simple Power, and we built 52 sites with wind turbines. And the core team from Simple Power has actually come together to build strategic power projects. And it truly is an all-island business. We have 18 projects under development, and we are a lot more modest than Marcin's headline. But when you do work it through, those projects currently stand at over €1 billion of investment that will come into Ireland over the next 3 to 5 years. As some of you will know, Patrick in particular, project development is very expensive. It takes an awful lot of cash up front, and that has to be brought into a business by way of private equity. But it's also very high risk, and John and some of the others on the panel earlier mentioned bringing the community with us when we are developing projects. And that is very important, that a lot of our projects face opposition with local communities who don't maybe understand the technology or don't appreciate having solar panels or anaerobic digesters near to their homes. So we really do have to bring the education and the hearts and minds of the public with us when we're developing these projects. But when we set out to target our investors, we needed to have somebody who understood the cash that was required and the risk that was involved, but also the opportunity. And so we were very privileged to secure investment earlier this year from Gresham House. Gresham House is a leading European renewable energy fund, and they are actually the single largest owner and operator of battery storage projects in the UK. So apart from them bringing their cash into our business, we also have the experience and the expertise that they bring from having built out the battery storage projects that they have in the UK. Just to give you an example of two projects, this project is in Road in Offaly. Very difficult to pick up the scale there on the slide, but it's 400 acres of solar PV, which will generate about 130 megawatts of energy every year. 50 megawatts of battery storage. To take what Neil said earlier, it's important that you can generate the power and then store it if it's not needed at that particular time, and then release it to the network when it is needed. This project, we secured planning approval in less than 12 months, and that's crucial in taking these developments forward. We're awaiting a grid connection offer for it, but this project will be built in 2023 and operational with a cost of over 100 million euros. A second example, if we can, no, it's not going through, but we have another site. Oh, there we go. Another site just across the border in County Louth. Its first phase has been approved through planning in less than 6 months. And we might get a chance to chat about this on the panel. The legislation panel I thought was fascinating. And there are so many things that I could have said around the legislation piece. But basically, to build anything, you need planning. And without planning being implemented in a very positive and efficient way, we can't deliver projects. So I'm looking forward to bringing some of our projects through in the north over the next few months. But thank you.
So our panel is going to be on creating the green economy of the future, and we're delighted to have Sam McCloskey, the Director of Sustainability and Climate Resilience from Tetra Tech, with us today. Sam has vast experience in this area, including she's worked on environmentally and sustainability projects, including the ERDF-funded policy, regulatory and stakeholder engagement project in EnvironWise during 2011. So we're delighted to have that panel, as I say, chaired by Sam, but first we'll have a brief video from Phoenix.
Hello, and welcome to Phoenix Meets, a new series of industry discussions that puts us in front of key stakeholders and personnel who are delivering change across the energy sector in Northern Ireland.
I think there's a much greater awareness of climate change, of the need to take action now.
There's no other grid in the world that has as much wind energy on it as Northern Ireland when it's windy.
The one thing that stands the test of time is Northern Ireland people.
It's technically proven it can be done. It's now just the other parts of the chain and jigsaw which need forming.
This isn't a problem for future generations and future societies. It's something we need to start tackling now.
Take this extra wind power that's not needed, convert it into hydrogen, but go into the natural gas networks with that to blend the hydrogen into the methane gas which is in the pipes.
We are putting hydrogen pipelines into our production facility next year in readiness for increased volumes of hydrogen-ready boilers.
We'd be delighted if you would join us for the range of episodes.
Good morning, everyone. It's a real honour to be here this morning, and thank you very much for the opportunity to host this session this morning. I'm honoured to be joined by a distinguished panel who are online and obviously with me at a very timely time, not just because of COP, but this session is very much about growing the green economy or creating a green economy, I think it's called, but I think growing is where we need to be looking. And Invest and I are on the cusp of publishing a Green Economy Opportunities Report in Northern Ireland, and I had the good fortune of being able to work on it with them on behalf of Tetra Tech. So there's some exciting times ahead. We're grateful to Phoenix for sponsoring this session, and welcome the Chief Executive Officer, Michael McKinstry, here to the stage. We also have Chris Train, OBE, Executive and Senior Advisor to CT Energy. Good morning, Chris. Fiachra O'Donnell, who's the Director of Sustainability for NSERC, on the other side of me on the screen there. And you've all met Paul Carson this morning, who stepped in at the last minute to replace Ruth Kimbley, the Managing Director of Strategic Power Projects. I think just to kick off the session, I'm going to ask Chris. We're on the cusp of seeing an eagerly anticipated energy strategy in Northern Ireland, a little bit delayed perhaps, but we're hoping to see it in the next few weeks. I'd like to get, Chris, your view on how well placed we are to drive forward the green economy of the future on the energy side.
Thank you very much, Sam, and thank you very much for the invite. It is an interesting time because clearly we are being challenged to deliver our decarbonisation solutions. And during the COP26 conference, that really heightens the focus and attention that we have in achieving that. And the last COP conference that delivered the net zero ambition really was a game changer in my mind, in the way that the energy sector and other sectors have had to look at the decarbonisation, because there's nowhere to hide. In the previous targets, 80-20, you could always say, well, somebody else is going to deliver. When you set the ambition at net zero, then everybody has to deliver. And we've made a lot of progress in the power sector. And in some ways, as challenging that has been as an opportunity, we now have to do the hard stuff. And what do I mean by the hard stuff? I mean the bits that are linked to customer choice and delivering what customers need and their ability to make their contributions to decarbonisation. And what do they want? They want things that are easy, they want to minimise disruption, and they want as low cost as possible. In the UK, our Prime Minister Boris Johnson produced his 10-point plan in December last year. Doesn't seem very long ago, but following on from that, we've had the Energy White Paper and the hydrogen strategy document that was published in August, and a number of consultation documents that go with that, along with, critically, the heat and building strategy. And I think the thing that's become very clear for me, and I think is getting clearer around the industry, is that this is not an either-or technology debate, but requires a whole system approach to the delivery. Energy efficiency, green electricity, and green gases. And it's on this basis that I believe that Northern Ireland is really well placed to drive forward with a green economy. Ireland, like Scotland, actually, as highlighted in the starting video for this session, is rich in wind resource, some of the best in Europe, and has made good progress, but has the opportunity to develop even further. But the system already has large volumes of curtailment of that energy, and that will increase as the sector grows. And this is the opportunity to create the green hydrogen economy. At a marginal cost of production, reducing the cost for customers and creating a green energy system, a system for all customers and not just the few. And the Phoenix gas network, and I'm sure Michael will come on to this as well, is relatively new as gas networks go, and therefore it is plastic, and therefore it is largely hydrogen ready. And the conversion costs will be low, certainly compared to the GB, which is a much more mature network system. So that offers, I think, Northern Ireland a terrific opportunity. Also, Northern Ireland has big biofuels opportunity and the opportunity to become a net exporter of green energy, as well as an importer of the green economy jobs. So I think with the right ambition and the right policy framework in place, and just listening to Paul there, also actually delivering against that framework around areas like planning, I believe Northern Ireland has the opportunity to become actually a global leader in delivering the green energy system of the future. It's got like the right combination of resources, and therefore with the right intent, I think there is a real leadership opportunity there. Thanks, Sam.
That's great, Chris. Thank you. It's great to hear that optimism. I think quite often we hear about climate change and those issues with a lot of negativity, and some optimism and opportunity talk is excellent to hear. Given that we are well placed, in your view, Chris, I think I'll move on to the other screen and to Fiachra to ask him what he sees as the enablers to enable us to move forward. Fiachra, how do we maximise the opportunities that arise in the drive to net zero?
Hey, thanks, Sam, and thanks, Phoenix, for the invite today. I think there's a couple of important things that we must do. The first there, Chris mentioned about this ability to be maybe a net exporter of energy and so on, but I think from our perspective, we really need to understand what it is that we need first to really map this out, to find out what are the key areas that we need to decarbonize and what is the best way to do that. So, is that biomethane for transport, or to be totally selfish about this from an industry perspective, biomethane for industry seems a much, much better choice. And that, I think, then relates back to, again, the policy frameworks and so on that Chris alluded to, and the importance of having those properly and clearly defined, and also challenging in that it's pushing us to carry out these activities. Those documents, those framework documents, regulations, whatever way we want to call them, and I think then need to be really joined up. A few weeks ago, we had a Northern Ireland Chamber event in Belfast. The First and Deputy First Minister spoke at it. They spoke glowingly about sustainability and activities that we could do and so on, but they mentioned about 5 different departments at that stage. And that having that coordinated approach to make sure that there's that interdepartmental understanding of what it is that we need to do, again, so that we can make sure that we're putting in the best solution for the challenges that are presented to us. The local government link to that, I think, is important as well. So if we look at the impact potentially of circular economy and what it can do to help us decarbonize, and if we take decarbonisation, and a fundamental aspect of that is use less. If we can use less energy, use less raw materials, use less packaging materials, and so on, that gives us a really strong start. So integrating those aspirations, like through the circular economy strategic framework, looking at wastes that we have and how do we make sure that we get those back, and how do we make sure that we can use those, and I use the word wastes as they're defined for some, but they're a raw material for others. If I take cullet, for example, which is raw material, recycled glass, we're not particularly good in Northern Ireland at getting that back. The figures are in the 50s. We don't have to look too far for an example of something that works particularly well. If you go to Wales, Wales are in the high 80%. They're number 3 in the world in terms of recycling capabilities. So let's not try and reinvent things. Let's use what other people have done and achieved, and let's make sure that we exploit those to our benefit. The next thing then again is I think the rollout of those energies. We heard David Surplus earlier there talking about hydrogen in the video. We have electrification of aspects coming through. We have biomethane that we've mentioned a couple of times so far. How are they going to work? How are they going to be put through the network? How are we in the far west of Northern Ireland sitting in the back end of nowhere in Fermanagh going to get access to these fuels that we need to really decarbonise our business and really support that position of glass. And then as we look at all these different technologies that are coming through, or all these different energies, we need that skills base to be coming in to support those as well, because there's many, many challenges with that. We're in the process of looking at hydrogen, for example. Hydrogen is a totally burn profile to natural gas. So how does that work in our furnaces? What do we need to be able to do in the future in terms of design or furnaces or burner designs or control systems or whatever? So we need that skills focus coming through. And then the final thing I would like to mention again, and this relates back to that whole idea of using less, being much more au fait with what it is that we do. And that's that role of technology. So technology is coming in to help us support prototyping technologies, demonstration technologies. How do we switch a furnace that's using X amount of kilowatt hours per day of natural gas to one that's a combination of hydrogen and biomethane and electricity that allows us to get in? So I think that they're the main areas for me, Sam.
Thank you, Fiacre. I'm not sure many people would describe Fermanagh as the back end of nowhere. It's a beautiful part of the world. It's just a shame you can't be here today. So, but I understand the issues of driving a fuel system that I suppose is far off from certain grid constraints. We have had some amazing panellists. We have some amazing panellists with us today, and Paul's already alluded to some conversations that he had or heard earlier on, particularly around legislation. I mean, given that we have the group of people here today, how do we learn from each other? How do we learn from other countries, from other regions? Paul?
Yeah, that's a crucial point, actually, Sam. I was hoping to be able to ask a question of John earlier on the panel. But basically, I do a lot in the Republic, and when I watch how the government actually operates there, particularly as a coalition, I think it sets out a very distinct example of how the executive at Stormont is still lacking in joined up approach to government. And later this afternoon, the Irish government will actually publish a revised climate action plan. That's their second climate action plan in about 18 months. And I think that the way the Irish government approaches it is that the government issues the climate action plan, and then that puts actions down into each department and covers every sector of the economy and the public sector. And I would very much like to see that when the new assembly comes through, if they would prioritise an overarching climate action plan, and then each department went and brought in its own legislative enabling legislation, I think that would be tremendous, because at the moment you've got different departments doing different things, but they're not actually focused on the one goal. And then you have pieces like the Minister for Infrastructure is very soon going to introduce a review of planning policy for renewable projects. But planning policy isn't the issue. It's how planning applications are processed in the councils or by her own department. And we need to have a positive can-do approach to planning to enable renewable development projects to happen. And the reason I showed the two example projects is that we can achieve planning for very significant, substantial sized projects in the south in less than 6 months. And yet I can give you examples of planning applications in Northern Ireland that have been in the system for 6 years. So there's an awful lot can be done. As the blah, blah, blah comment this week, it's time to get some action, and we can learn from other jurisdictions how to implement that action on the ground.
Thanks, Paul. The planning issue is very, very clearly evidenced there. When we do have the energy strategy published, I mean, that's only the start of our story. There are a number of action plans that we will need to be and look forward to see after that. So hopefully planning is up front and centre there amongst other things. Going to move on to Michael. Faker's already mentioned innovation and the need to support emerging technology in the green economy. What's your view on how that needs to be encouraged, brought forward, or supported, Michael?
Yeah, I think first of all, it's great to be here today, and glad that so many were able to join us, both online and here in person. I think from our point of view, and I'll maybe try and look at the aspect slightly differently. It's been all about the first 25 years and now the next 25 years. We have brought gas to Northern Ireland in 1996, and the whole focus in that time has been to get people to move away from the existing fuel, which is oil, towards gas, and that has been great. And we have managed to grow the market to the stage today where we're over 300,000 properties on gas. There's another 200,000 who could go to gas from oil, who are readily connectable, and that's great and that's fine. And every time someone moves, they have the opportunity to reduce their carbon footprint by 50%. So the carbon credentials historically have been very strong, and we have been on the right side of every government initiative, and that's great. However, the game changer, as Chris mentioned, happened whenever we said net zero. And in that context, we realised as an industry, we need to change because what we currently flow would not get us to net zero. We needed to find a way to decarbonise the gas, to have gas which had low carbon or no carbon in it. And in that regard, that changed the equation. Historically, hydrogen has been talked about and has been used historically. And the great benefit of it is it provides no carbon output. So it's a fantastic product. Economically, it wasn't necessarily as strong as natural gas, so therefore it was never examined. So the industry has been going through radical review over the last 3-4 years to really push forward, well, how would hydrogen, how would renewable gases replace natural gas in the network so that we can utilise those networks of gas infrastructure right across these islands. From our point of view, to some extent Northern Ireland's been watching because the way in which you deploy natural gas, either on a blended basis or in a fully utilised basis, is a big project. And the industry in GB is much greater and has greater scale to be able to do those projects. So they have been working on both blending of hydrogen and biomethane with natural gas, which we can do up to 20% and not change any of the appliances. That's great, that could be a first step. But they've also been looking at what goes beyond that, because that doesn't get us to net zero, which is full hydrogen replacement. And both those projects have got really, really positive results in a very, very short space of time. So I think that's the important thing to bear in mind. Where does Northern Ireland come in? Well, we can sit and wait, and that's what we've done to date, I guess. And to some extent, that was right to do because of the scale of the sort of projects. But the actual play here, which is a green hydrogen, how do we produce green hydrogen? How do we actually generate biomethane to be introduced into the network, is going to be a localised delivery play. And the great thing, and we've heard it in various stages today, is that we've got a plentiful of those sort of products that will actually facilitate that type of production. So we've got curtailed wind already, even though we're only halfway towards where we need to get to as far as the electricity industry is concerned with regard to wind assets. It'll get much worse over time, and therefore hydrogen provides, or the ability to convert that curtailed wind into hydrogen provides an ideal opportunity to actually capture as a byproduct another fuel and resolve another issue with regard to renewable gases. The other thing is our agriculture industry, and I come from a farming background, so therefore I appreciate it fully. Our agriculture industry are really being put under the collar to some extent to come up with solutions that will allow us to maintain the wonderful agri-food industry that we actually produce here. And in that regard, biomethane and what we do with it, how do we capture it, how do we utilise it, is a big challenge. And the opportunity to actually capture it properly and effectively and in scale in Northern Ireland is there. We haven't got any injection of biomethane into the gas network. Yet in GB it's happening as a matter of course. You have to ask the question why, and that's mainly because there hasn't been the focus, there hasn't been the legislation, and there hasn't been the opportunities to do so. So we need to get on with doing that. It's known technology, so it's not innovation to some extent, but there's lots of advocates like yourself who actually can actually support that, and we just need to find a way to do that. And then the hydrogen idea, it's much newer. Hydrogen's an old product, but the idea of actually producing hydrogen from curtailed wind is a newer idea because it's come out of another issue. But it has got fantastic opportunities. We are very like Scotland in many ways, some people would say, but we also have a very similar climate, and we have a very similar opportunity because we have a lot of shoreline. So from that point of view, there is great opportunities here for really developing our own energy sources. And what we need to do now is we need to spend the time over the next 2 to 3 years actually proving it's capable of happening. Because it's one thing talking about it, blah, blah, blah. It's another thing actually starting to deliver projects. And I think we can sit and wait. We've sat and wait to some extent. Maybe it's because of the lack of momentum in Northern Ireland, but whatever. We have sat and waited, and to some extent now is the time for us to take action and actually do something about this.
Thank you, Michael. I read somewhere very recently that 90% of the technology that we're going to need to meet our net zero targets in 2050 is now at prototype or demonstration phase. So there's an awful lot of work. And I know there are people in this room that are helping to drive that innovation forward. I think that's all that we have time for this session. Today is Energy Day at COP, so we've been well represented by representatives from the energy and the manufacturing sector on the stage today. I hope you join with me in thanking Fiacre, Michael, Paul and Chris for their contributions, and thank you all for listening this morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sam. Michael, thank you very much. Can we have a round of applause for our moderators as well this morning, Carol and Victoria? The Mayor of Lahti, Finland, Pekka Timonen, is in the house, so I think we'll give him a round of applause. In these green times, we've only 2 visitors from America. One of them is Mark Goldstone, who's also in the house. He's from New York, so he gets a round of applause. And Sean Summers from Boston. We have a quota. We have to have 1 person from Boston at least. So Sean Summers from Boston is here this morning. He'll be back later on. So a round of applause for Sean Summers. Now you get a little bit of a break. Are you going to round tables, which is really a discussion around 2 different issues relating to the green transition. One issue is, of course, the fact that for a small city we have big city traffic. Despite the insistence and the determination to move to a greener mode of travel. And Duncan Morrow is here from the University of Ulster University, and he's going to do a round table relating to this magnificent transformative development we now have in Belfast city centre in the inner North City, which is the new campus of the University of Ulster. And that is, as we see every day, because I see the young people now getting off at the 2 nearest train stations, neither of which really is near to the campus, but that's another matter. So you see it already starting to transform the city, but how do we make sure that the benefits of the new campus extend to everyone? And that means that it doesn't, the communities around it don't become car parks for the university. So we need to find a sustainable mode of transport. So Duncan is in the bridge, which is here. My geography is very bad. This way? Oh, so it's over there. Okay, so Duncan is there. So that's what those green boards are for. Okay. Duncan, thank you very much. So anyone who wants to contribute to that debate on trying to make the city a better city for sustainable transport, over there. Those who want to go for a small walk, they have to go upstairs. And Carol will be upstairs at a round table in the bridge. And that round table is about what supports are available for businesses and social enterprises and organisations which want to decarbonise, which want to become greener. And we're really delighted that we have a strong turnout of some of the agencies and government bodies who are in a position to offer advice and maybe as well some cash. We love advice, but we prefer some cash. And that'll be upstairs. And Carol has with her Declan McGarrigle from Special EU Programmes Body, Paul Brown, who's representing the Department of the Economy, and the Minister for the Economy is in at COP26 today. We also have Declan, I think it is, from Central Procurement Directorate. Paul Brown is from the Central Procurement Directorate. Thomas Byrne is from the Department for the Economy. Mark Welch of Energy is here as well, representing Belfast Met and the initiatives they're doing. And Kieran Boylan's here as a partner with Locus Management. And Kieran authored the first report in the city to scope out the opportunities from the green economy. So thanks for staying with us so far. Mila Buihis, big thanks to all those online as well, including some of our contributors who had to drop out because they're either isolating or have COVID. It's great that you were with us so far this morning. We're going to take this break for the 2 round tables. So sustainable travel, bike over that way, and you walk upstairs by Shanks's Mare for the supports for the green transition. Thank you very much. Thank you.